Hey guys, tonight, we step into a quiet school hallway just after sunset, where the fluorescent lights flicker faintly above faded green lockers, and the air smells faintly of paper dust and time that's gone stagnant. You're alone, except of course for the countless framed class photos lining the corridor walls. Smiling faces, year after year. Except one. One photo doesn't smile back. They say once you're in that picture, something changes. Your shadow starts behaving differently. People forget your name, even when you're in the room. And if you look too closely, you might see someone standing behind you. Someone who wasn't in the room when the photo was taken. You probably won't survive this if you're the curious type. But then again, if you're here with me, that probably describes you perfectly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It started with a photo no one remembered being taken. Dorian Chambers had been teaching English at Belridge Secondary School for 9 years in a town that measured time more by football seasons and harvest cycles than calendars. He wasn't a man prone to superstitions, nor one to question the little anomalies that often slipped unnoticed in old buildings. But that photo bothered him. It showed Class 9C 2006, 24 students arranged in 3 rows. Dorian stood at the far right, smiling stiffly in his old corduroy blazer. That part made sense. What didn't was that Dorian didn't remember teaching that class. In fact, he didn't even start at Belridge until the autumn of 2007. He stared at the frame under the humming lights one late afternoon, after most of the staff had left. The hallway was hushed in that hollow way only schools get when they're emptied of children. His eyes traced each face, some vaguely familiar, others completely alien. But all of them looked wrong. Not an expression, just too still, too balanced, like mannequins staged for authenticity. And each eye, every single one, seemed to catch the camera's light in exactly the same way, giving all 24 students and himself a mirrored gleam across their irises. He leaned closer, breath fogging the glass slightly. His own face stared back at him with a small, polite smile, one he knew he never wore in photos, and behind the rows, nestled in the soft blur of the library shelves, a shape, vague gray, almost imperceptible. It might have been a coat rack, might have been a smudge, but Dorian didn't think so. It felt like a person, tall, indistinct, and too symmetrical to be unintentional. He rubbed the glass, but the image didn't change. The next day he brought it up casually in the staff room over tea and shortbread biscuits. "Do any of you remember 9C back in '06? He asked. Marjorie, the head of history for over 20 years, frowned. "Before your time, wasn't it?" "That's what I thought," he replied, "but there's a photo of me in it." "Down the East Hall." "Oh," she said, stirring her tea. "That hallway." Her voice dropped a bit on those last 2 words. "What about it?" he pressed. Marjorie hesitated. "Odd stories. A bit of local folklore. Nothing serious. The kids sometimes say they feel cold when they walk past the class photos. Especially that one." She gestured vaguely toward the hall, eyes lowered. "Why not take it down then?" She looked at him. "Because no one remembers putting it up." Dorian blinked. "They tried once," she added. "Back in 2011, I think. A custodian took it down. The next morning it was back. Same spot. Same frame." He almost laughed, but her face was stone set, and the room had gone very still. He finished his tea and said nothing more. That evening, Dorian returned to the hallway. The school was empty again. The lights flickered. The air had the same heavy silence. The photo was there exactly where it had been. He stood before it this time with his phone ready. He snapped a picture, but when he checked the screen, the image had glitched, jagged lines, smeared colors, and no recognizable faces. Only a gray haze where the people should be. He tried again. Same result. Frustrated, he took the frame off the wall. It came loose easily in his hands. No supernatural resistance, no flash of fear. Just the creak of wood and the scent of old glass. He turned it over. There was no name on the back, no date, only a faint fingerprint burned into the wood like something scorched itself, and not with heat, but with time. Dorian replaced the frame. He walked away, but he didn't hear the footsteps that followed him down the hall. Not yet. That night, sleep came to Dorian in short bursts, brief flickers of unconsciousness interrupted by sounds he couldn't place. A thud, like a book falling. A whisper of breath that didn't belong to him. At 3:13 a.m., he woke with the distinct sense that someone had been leaning over his bed. He sat up slowly, heart pounding the room thick with the kind of darkness that pressed inward. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't move. But across the room by the wardrobe, something gleamed faintly. 2 pinpricks of light too far apart to be reflections. He stared until they disappeared. In the morning, Dorian found no sign of disturbance. The wardrobe door was shut. Nothing seemed out of place except his phone, which had been on his nightstand when he went to sleep, now rested on the floor by the doorway screen cracked across the center. He picked it up, powered it on. The photo app had been opened. One image had been taken at 3:12 a.m. A single photo, a close-up of the class portrait on the hallway wall. But in this version, Dorian wasn't standing in a row. His place was empty, and the gray blur in the background was no longer vague. It had eyes. He dropped the phone. For a long time, he sat on the edge of the bed, unmoving, listening. When he returned to the school that morning, he walked directly to the hallway. The portrait was still there, still fixed perfectly to the wall. But the longer he stared at it, the more things seemed wrong. Not just with the people, but with the setting. The background wasn't the school library. It was similar, but the shelves were stacked with books that had no titles. The walls were darker. The ceiling beams warped as though bent under weight, and the floor beneath the group was black mat-like ash. He stepped back, then heard a voice behind him. "You shouldn't look at it too long." He turned. It was one of the students, Lila Morgan. Quiet girl, always reading. Her eyes were red-rimmed like she hadn't slept. "Why not?" he asked. She bit her lip. "Because if you do, it starts to look at you." He waited, but she didn't explain further. Instead, she turned and walked away, the hem of her uniform skirt fluttering like smoke behind her. At lunch, he found her in the library. She sat at a back table near the windows, surrounded by open books. "You said something earlier," he began. "About the photo." She looked up. Her hands were trembling slightly. "I shouldn't have said anything." "But you did." Lila's eyes darted toward the far end of the library where the older stacks leaned in unnatural silence. "There's a story," she whispered, "about the class in the photo. People say they're not dead. They're paused, like between things, between being real and being forgotten. The photo keeps them that way, but it doesn't want to be alone." Dorian pulled out a chair. "So it adds people. Sometimes people who've looked at it too long, or taken pictures of it, or..." She stopped. He waited. "Or dreamed of it." Dorian felt the weight of her words sink into his spine. "Do you know their names?" "No one does. Not anymore. The names vanish. Even the school records don't list a 9C in 2006. There was no class 9C that year." "But I'm in the photo," Dorian said softly. Lila stared at him for a long time. "No," she said. "You were in the photo." And then she pushed a torn page across the table. It was a printed copy of the photo. Rough resolution. Grainy. Dorian looked closely. He wasn't there, but someone else stood in his place. Tall, gray, too symmetrical. It wasn't a person. It was the shape. And where its eyes should be, 2 black smears, like fingerprints pressed into wet paint. The edges of the image had begun to curl like heat had touched it from within. He looked at Lila again, but she was already closing her books. "Don't go back down that hallway," she said. He didn't respond. He just sat there staring at a photograph that was rewriting itself. And in the space where his image used to be, something else had taken hold. The school bell echoed through the halls. But Dorian didn't move. He remained in the library, surrounded by the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the rustle of pages being turned by other students who knew nothing about what had taken root in the east hallway. The copy of the photo Lila had given him lay flat on the table, curling slightly at the corners, its surface dim and grainy. His own image gone, and in his place, that tall, vague figure with a posture too still, too perfect, and eyes like holes punched into the paper. It wasn't the kind of change you could explain with ink bleed or faulty printing. The thing had shape. It had presence. And as he stared at it longer, it seemed to become more defined. A shift in the shoulders, a bend in the elbow, like it had begun to mimic the exact posture he remembered himself having the first time he looked into that glass frame. When he finally left the library, it was almost dusk. The corridors were mostly empty, except for the low murmur of teachers gathering bags and folders, the day's noise shrinking into the distance. But as Dorian passed the east hallway, something made him stop, not because he wanted to, but because it wanted him to. The lights above the corridor buzzed louder here, like a nest of flies just out of view, and the air smelled faintly of dust and iron. The photo was still on the wall, perfectly aligned frame, clean and clear. He approached, slowly holding his breath. For a moment, it looked like the version he'd always known. But the closer he came, the more his eyes adjusted to the changes. The smile on one of the students' faces had bent subtly downward. Another had shifted ever so slightly, like she'd tilted her head after the flash. And then, there it was again, the figure. Not behind them now, but standing directly in the last row, one hand laid across a student's shoulder. The student didn't react. None of them did. Frozen eyes reflecting a light that hadn't touched that room in years. Dorian's own heart pounded loudly in his chest, louder than the flickering buzz of the lights, louder than the growing pressure in his skull. He reached up and touched the glass. The moment his fingers made contact, the air in the hallway changed, thickened. Every sound dulled as though the world outside had sunk underwater. Behind the glass, the eyes of the figure gleamed, not a reflection of light, but something more internal, a shimmer like sunlight off deep oil. And then it blinked. Dorian staggered backward, heart hammering, the cold sweat blooming across his neck. He looked again. The figure was still, but its head, it had turned, just slightly. No one had touched the frame. The students remained frozen, but the figure had turned its head toward him. The buzzing grew louder now. The overhead lights dimmed for just a second, then flared, casting long shadows down the tiled floor. And from somewhere at the far end of the hall, there was a sound quiet, dragging, rhythmic, like shoes too large being pulled across linoleum. Something was walking toward him. Dorian turned, but the hallway behind him was empty. Still the sound continued. Closer now, not fast, but steady. He took a step away from the photo, another, then ran. Back in the staff room, he locked the door and sat down, trying to calm the racing panic that climbed up the back of his throat. He wasn't a man who gave in to superstition, but he also wasn't a fool. Something was wrong. Something was inside that photo. Or worse, something was using it. He opened his cracked phone, pulled up the camera app, and flipped it to selfie mode. Nothing unusual, no shadows, no figure behind him. But when he tried to take another picture of the photo in the hall, the app froze again. Screen static. The lens refused to focus. Every time. At home that evening, he searched the school archives. There was no 9C in 2006. The yearbook skipped from 9B to 9D. The physical records were missing. Digital files corrupted. Every attempt to research the students in the image returned nothing. No names, no enrollment history, no addresses. It was as if the class had never existed except in that one photograph. And it was as if the photograph didn't want them to be remembered. That night, Dorian dreamed in monochrome. He stood inside the school hallway, but it was longer, much longer than it had ever been. No doors, no windows, just framed photographs stretching endlessly on both walls, each one showing different groups of students. Some looked normal, some didn't. Some had faces blurred into featureless gray. Others had entire rows missing. And in every single photo, no matter the year, no matter the group, that tall, still figure stood in the background, closer in some, farther in others, always watching. And Dorian knew somehow that if he turned around, he would see the real hallway behind him collapsing into darkness. That if he ran, the photographs would follow him. That if he woke up too slowly, he might take something back with him. He woke just before dawn, breathless, the bed sheets wrapped around his legs like vines. His hands trembled. His neck ached. There was dirt beneath his fingernails, and on the nightstand beside him, where his cracked phone had been charging, lay a single old-fashioned photo print, the class of 9C 2006. His image was no longer missing. He was back in the photo, but this time he wasn't smiling. He was staring forward, expressionless, eyes dark, and just behind him, barely visible in the shadow between the students, two pale hands resting on his shoulders. He didn't scream, not because he wasn't terrified, he was, but because something deeper than fear had taken root inside him. Something colder, more ancient. The photograph trembled faintly in his hand as if it still breathed. He stared at his own face, grayish, hollow eyes, vacant. There was no mistaking it. It wasn't just that he looked different. It was a different version of him altogether. A version with nothing behind the eyes. A shell. And those hands. Long, pale, gently resting on his shoulders. The fingers were far too thin, too elegant, and bent at angles that didn't seem natural. But the most disturbing part was how gentle they looked, like someone guiding, not harming. As if whatever stood behind him thought it was helping, Dorian stood the photo still clutched in his hand. He turned the bedroom light on fully. Nothing changed. No illusions shattered. No tricks of the eye. The photograph was real, and it was fresh. The edges weren't aged. The ink hadn't faded. It was a new print, a product of something that had been watching him the night before, perhaps even standing just out of sight. He burned it, not ceremoniously, not with salt or incantation, just a match in the kitchen sink. He watched the flames chew through the glossy surface, curling the edges until the image vanished into smoke. But even as the ashes swirled down the drain, he didn't feel relief. He felt absence, like he'd just erased something that wanted desperately to be remembered. He arrived at school just after sunrise. The halls were dim, and the custodians hadn't yet turned on the main overhead lights. Only the emergency fluorescents glowed down the east corridor, casting a thin yellow haze over the photo wall. He walked toward it. The Class 9C photo was gone. Not blank, gone. A small strip of wall showed a rectangle of cleaner paint where it had hung for decades. Dust around it undisturbed. No frame, no broken glass, no fallen hook. It hadn't been removed. It had been taken. He turned on his heel and made straight for the front office. But the secretary wasn't there yet. Only a substitute janitor stood in the corner mopping quietly, his head down. "Have you seen the class photo that was here?" Dorian asked. The man didn't look up, just muttered, "Which one?" 9C. 2 frames from the left by the water fountain. A long pause. Then the janitor finally lifted his eyes. There was something wrong with his face. Not deformity, something missing. His expression was neutral, smooth, but his gaze was utterly blank. No recognition, no warmth, just a void that made Dorian's chest tighten. "There's never been a 9C photo," the man said flatly. I saw it yesterday. I've seen it all week. No, the man replied again. You brought it. Dorian's breath caught. What did you say? The janitor lowered his gaze, continued mopping. You brought it, he said again, this time more quietly. Like they all do. Dorian backed away. He didn't ask what he meant. He didn't want to know, at least not from him. He walked quickly back to his classroom, locked the door behind him, and drew all the blinds. He sat at his desk, staring at nothing, while the rising hum of students returning filled the building with hollow energy. At lunch, Lila returned. She didn't speak at first, just closed the door and sat across from him. You burned it, she said softly. He didn't ask how she knew. They don't like that, she continued. Who doesn't? She looked at him, then really looked at him. The ones behind the frame. They wait. And when someone notices them, they borrow the shape of the person who didn't forget. What do they want? Lila's hands twisted in her lap. To be real. To replace. That's what the photo is. It's a doorway. A memory trap. Every time someone notices them, they get stronger. The longer you stare, the more they resemble you. Until you're the one standing still and they're the one walking away. You said it happened before, he said. She nodded. 3 teachers in the last decade. One vanished mid-semester. The other died in his sleep heart failure, but the autopsy found ash in his lungs. The third, he went mad. Said his reflection wouldn't follow him anymore. Then he locked himself in the East Wing overnight. No one ever found him. Dorian swallowed throat dry. Why are you still here? Lila hesitated. Because I stopped looking. I refuse to remember them. I look away. I speak their names wrong. I draw over their faces in my notes. If they can't hold shape in your memory, they fade. That's the only thing that works. He nodded slowly. But deep down, he knew it was already too late for that. Because last night, he hadn't just seen the figure. He'd felt it. Fingers on his shoulder, cold breath at his ear. And now, he wasn't sure how many people in the school could still see him. That afternoon, the bell rang like it always did, shrill and final, dismissing the students into the honeyed light of early evening. Dorian remained seated behind his desk, watching the last of them filter out their chatter, trailing behind like vapor. Lila had been the last to leave. She'd given him a small nod, as if confirming something unspoken between them, then stepped into the corridor, her shadow briefly stretching unnaturally long before disappearing behind the closing door. Silence fell, but it wasn't comforting. He stood and walked slowly toward the classroom window. The courtyard below looked still almost frozen, as if someone had draped plastic over the world outside. Tree branches twitched in place but didn't sway. A single leaf hung in mid-fall, suspended in the air like a caught breath. And through the haze of dusty glass, he noticed something that made his stomach pull tight, the reflection of the hallway behind him. But the reflection didn't match the room. There was someone standing at the door. He turned sharply. No one. He looked back to the window. Still there, a faint silhouette in the glass, tall and unmoving, where no one stood in real space. He reached out to the glass fingertips grazing the cool surface. The reflection didn't waver. Its arms hung perfectly straight at its sides. Its head was slightly tilted as if listening. No features, just an outline, but it was undeniably human in shape, disturbingly familiar in size and frame. It stood exactly where he had stood in that cursed class photo. Dorian stepped back. The reflection didn't follow. Not yet. By the time the sun dipped below the hills, the school was empty again. He should have gone home. Should have turned off the lights, locked his door, and walked into the clean safety of the outside world. But something compelled him to stay. Not curiosity. Not even fear. Obligation. Like something had already decided this was his now. He returned to the east hallway. The photographs were all still in place. Every graduating class from 1982 onward, except 9C 2006, still gone. But the space where it had hung it had changed. The wall was darker, subtly warped, as though something had pressed against it from the inside. He stepped closer, rested his palm flat against the paint. The wall felt soft, not like drywall, more like old paper. And for the briefest second, something on the other side pressed back. Dorian recoiled, heart hammering, backing into the opposite wall. He looked around. Empty corridor, buzzing lights, faint echo of his own breath. Then he heard it. A whisper, not in his ear, not in the hallway, but inside his head. A voice low and breathless saying only one thing: turn around. He didn't. He couldn't. His body locked with instinctual dread. But slowly, like the dragging of a needle through soft cloth, his eyes shifted toward the reflection in the trophy case just ahead. Glass, polished and clean. His own reflection stared back, only it wasn't quite right. His eyes weren't following the movement. His mouth was slightly open. And behind that version of himself, something was reaching up over his shoulders. Two pale hands, long-fingered, sliding into view. He closed his eyes, stepped away, didn't run, just walked, back to his classroom door shut and locked again. He sat in the dark, staring at the now black screen of his phone. No signal, no battery, just his own pale face dimly mirrored in the glass. The same haunted expression, the same helpless weight behind his eyes. And then behind him something creaked, not loud, not threatening, just a shift of floorboards, a sigh of old wood responding to presence. He stood slowly, turned, nothing there, but the room felt different now, slightly colder, slightly smaller, as if the walls had leaned in just enough to change the shape of the air. On the desk where his lesson planner had been was a photograph, a new one. He hadn't heard it appear, hadn't seen anyone come in. But there it was, glossy, pristine. Class 9C, 2006. This time the photo was different. He was there again, but smiling now, wide and unnatural eyes dull as polished marbles. Everyone else wore the same expression. Identical smiles, identical stares. And in the back row behind the middle column stood the gray figure, clearer than ever, its face still featureless, but its posture unmistakable. It was mirroring him, hand on the same shoulder, tilted head, same height, same build. It wasn't in the photo anymore. It was trying to be him. Dorian clenched his fists. The photograph quivered in his hand like something alive. He wanted to burn it again, but somehow he knew it wouldn't work this time. This wasn't just an image anymore. It was a memory being rewritten in real time, and somewhere deep in the folds of the forgotten, something was watching, waiting for him to stop struggling, to finally let it step in. He didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time he shut his eyes, it wasn't darkness he saw, but that same long hallway stretching far too deep into the impossible. The photographs lining the walls didn't just watch, they moved when he blinked. He'd see them shift in position slightly, see mouths open that hadn't before, see shapes standing where no one had been a moment ago. He would jerk awake, chest tight, throat dry, and the real world would return, but not fully. There was something about the air in his home now, a stagnant stillness that hadn't been there before, like his house was mimicking the school's dead silence. Or worse, like the school had followed him home. He kept the lights on the blinds shut and tried to convince himself the last 2 days were just the result of some stress-induced hallucination, a psychological breakdown. He'd read about those. Hallucinations, sleep disruptions, memory confusion. Perfectly explainable. That's what he told himself, right up until he stepped into his kitchen just after dawn and saw muddy footprints across the tiles. They weren't his. They were bare, narrow, almost delicate in shape. And they stopped halfway through the kitchen facing the sink as if someone had stood there for a while watching the window, or waiting for him to arrive. He didn't follow them. He just left. At school, the day passed in a haze. Students drifted in and out of his classroom, their voices distant assignments forgotten. He taught on autopilot reading from the textbook, avoiding the east hallway entirely. But even in his own classroom, things began to shift. He noticed it in the corners of the whiteboard, faint stains that weren't there yesterday, circular smudges like fingerprints. His coffee cup, which he always set down on the right side of his desk, had moved itself to the left without him realizing. Twice. A small stack of graded papers disappeared entirely, only to reappear that evening in his car's back seat, slightly damp, smelling of wet earth. But it was the mirror that pushed him over the edge. In the staff restroom near the science wing, Dorian leaned toward the mirror to splash water on his face. He looked exhausted, skin, pale eyelids bruised with sleeplessness. But as he wiped his mouth and stared into the reflection, he saw something so slight, so subtle, that it might have gone unnoticed if he hadn't been staring already. His reflection was breathing out of sync with him. It exhaled a fraction too slow, blinked half a second too late, and then it smiled, just barely, but unmistakably. He stepped back so quickly, he knocked over the trash bin. The sound echoed off the tile. His heart pounded in his ears. He looked again. His reflection had returned to normal. But he didn't move for several minutes. Didn't blink. Didn't trust it. Later that night, he visited the school's archives. He needed answers. Something tangible. Something human. The archives were kept in a locked storeroom below the main office. A cramped basement space filled with metal filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with scrawled decades. He found 2006. Opened the drawer. There were no student records for Class 9C. No report cards. No attendance logs. Nothing. But something else was there, a manila folder, unmarked, placed deliberately at the front. He opened it. Inside were black and white photocopies. Dozens of them. All the same class photo. But each copy showed subtle differences. In one, 3 of the students were missing. In another, the background had become a field instead of a library. One showed the children standing ankle-deep in water. Another in total darkness, only their eyes visible. He flipped through them, heart accelerating. They weren't variations. They were progressions. Like a sequence, each image shifting closer to something else. Something raw. More honest. And then he found the final copy. It was blank. No students, no teacher, no background. Only one line typed at the bottom. When the last one looks away, we step through. His hands shook as he replaced the folder and locked the cabinet behind him. His mind screamed at him to leave, to go home, to forget. But he couldn't. Not when his own face had started to disappear from photographs at home. Not when his voice on a voicemail he'd left himself sounded different, deeper, slower, with a strange static undercurrent. Not when the shadows in his apartment now lingered 2 seconds longer than they should after he turned the lights on. He wasn't being haunted. He was being replaced. And it wasn't finished yet, because even as he sat in his car later that night, engine idling, staring at the school building under the glow of orange parking lot lights, he could feel it somewhere nearby. Not watching, not waiting, practicing being him. He left the school parking lot sometime after midnight. The campus empty and hushed, wrapped in that dense hush that only old places carry after dark. The gravel crackled under his tires like breaking glass, and the streetlights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering one by one as he passed beneath them. He didn't go straight home. He drove aimlessly through the sleeping town, past shuttered shops and quiet intersections, past the lake, where the water no longer rippled and the surface looked solid as black slate. His hands gripped the wheel too tightly. Every so often he checked his rearview mirror, half expecting to see a face that wasn't his, sitting in the back seat, staring blankly, mimicking his movements, with just enough delay to prove it wasn't real. By the time he reached his apartment, the sky was beginning to pale at the edges. Early morning fog hugged the sidewalk like spilled milk, low and creeping. His key trembled as he slid it into the lock, and when he stepped inside, The air felt wrong. The lights worked. The thermostat read the same. But the silence had changed. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something else. Something so still, it made the apartment feel like a museum exhibit. He walked room to room, checking closets' corners under the bed behind the shower curtain. Nothing. No intruders. No signs of forced entry. Just one subtle difference: the hallway mirror, which he always kept covered with a throw cloth, now uncovered. The cloth folded neatly at its base, like someone had peeled it back slowly and deliberately. He didn't approach. Didn't need to. From where he stood, he could see the reflection of the hallway behind him. But it was reversed. Not mirrored. Reversed. The photographs on the wall hung on the wrong side. The door opened opposite. The light fixture on the ceiling was gone. The reflection wasn't showing what was there. It was showing a version of the hallway that was close, but altered. And in that version of the hallway, there was someone standing near the bedroom door. A tall, blurred shape, not fully formed, still gathering, still stitching together features, but its posture was unmistakable. Shoulders slightly slumped, head tilted, and its hands, those long, impossibly pale hands, hung by its sides, twitching gently, like puppets waiting for strings. Dorian took one slow step backward, and the figure in the reflection did not follow. It stood still, but its head lifted slightly, like it had heard something. And then the lights in the apartment dimmed, not turned off, but dipped, as though the power itself were afraid. He stumbled backward into the kitchen, slammed the light switch up and down, heart-thudding, mouth dry. The bulbs flickered once, then flared painfully bright, so bright he had to shield his eyes. And when the light steadied, he looked back down the hall. The figure was gone. The mirror showed only him now, but his expression was blank. His arms hung low and still. His eyes didn't blink. He moved his hand. The reflection did not follow. It stared at him with a hollow, almost curious stillness. Then slowly, agonizingly slow, it raised its right hand just a few inches and let the fingers curl inward in a motion that looked exactly like waving goodbye. Dorian staggered back into the wall, gasping. The mirror cracked. Not shattered, just a single diagonal fracture like a hairline split in time itself. He ran, not from the apartment, but from everything. Down the stairs into the cold morning air, still in his work clothes. He didn't stop until he reached the old church on Ashwood Street, the one with the boarded windows and the broken bell tower. He hadn't been inside in years, but something primal pulled him there, like the structure itself could still remember what it was like to keep things out. The door was unlocked. He stepped inside. Dust coated every surface. Pews warped with rot. The altar faded with time. But it was silent. Blessedly, beautifully silent. He sat in the last pew, trying to calm his breath, to listen to something other than the whispering that had followed him for days. And for the first time, he let the thought bloom fully. What if I'm already gone? What if that thing didn't just want to replace me? It already did. He pulled out his phone. No service. No time displayed. Just a black screen. But something had loaded in the photo gallery, an image he hadn't taken. It was a selfie of him, standing in the hallway. Only it wasn't his hallway. The walls were gray, the pictures were blank, the door frames twisted inward like teeth, and he was smiling, so widely, so perfectly, with eyes so dark they seemed bottomless. He checked the timestamp. It read tomorrow. He stared at the timestamp until his eyes burned. Tomorrow. Not a date, just a promise, or maybe a warning. Dorian's thumb hovered over the delete button, but he couldn't bring himself to press it. Some instinct told him it wouldn't matter, that the image was already part of his phone, his mind, maybe even the thin film that separated his world from whatever place that photo came from. deleting it would be like scratching at a shadow useless too late. He left the church when the first rays of real morning light bled into the sky, casting pale gold across cracked pavement and skeletal trees. But light didn't soothe him anymore. Not when it revealed too much. On his way home, he saw reflections in every passing window, each one slightly delayed, like his image was struggling to keep up, as if whatever wasn't him was still learning how to walk in his skin. When he entered the apartment, it smelled different. Not foul, not decayed, just off like a memory slightly misremembered. He stood still at the threshold, listening. Silence. He walked in, scanning every surface, every frame. Everything was exactly where it had been, and that was the problem. He hadn't left his keys on the counter. He never folded his coat. The books on the shelf were arranged alphabetically now, something he had never had the patience for. Someone had been here. Someone who knew how he lived or thought they did. He moved slowly toward the hallway mirror again, heart thumping harder with every step. The fracture line across the glass remained, but it had deepened thin cracks, spiderwebbing outward, subtle but growing. He stared into it and saw only his own tired face. But it was waiting, he knew it, and as he stared, his reflection blinked. Just once. Too late again. Then very gently it smiled and mouthed something he couldn't hear but understood in his bones, almost ready. That night, he didn't go back to sleep. He packed a small duffel bag, filled it with clothes, a flashlight, a stack of notebooks, and the folder of printed photocopies he'd swiped from the school archive. He took his spare keys, left his phone face down on the kitchen table, and left. Not running, removing himself. Like you would, from a room slowly filling with smoke. But the moment he crossed into the parking lot, his vision blurred. He stumbled. The air shimmered, not like heat, but like a film was being peeled back. He saw just briefly the school hallway again. Dim, infinite, lined with glass frames, and in one of the frames, he saw himself standing there, eyes blank, lips, moving silently behind the glass. And then it was gone. He caught his breath, heart skittering, hand gripping the side mirror of his car for balance. It wasn't safe anywhere. Not really. But he had to try. He had to find someone who remembered the school the way he did. Someone outside the cycle. Someone who hadn't looked at that photo. There was only one person he could think of, Marjorie Holloway. Retired last he'd heard. She taught history at Belridge for over 20 years. Left quietly 3 years ago, just after the last attempt to remove the 9C photo. Lila had mentioned her briefly, and he remembered the way Marjorie's voice had dropped when she said, "That hallway." He drove across town to her house, an old brick cottage overgrown with ivy and shielded by heavy trees. It looked forgotten, the kind of place stories came to sleep. He knocked once, twice, then again louder. The door creaked open on its own. No wind, no sound, just the soft moan of old hinges. He hesitated, then stepped inside. The interior smelled of aged books, dried herbs, and something vaguely metallic like rusted nails soaked in rain. The furniture was covered in white sheets. The windows shuttered, but the hearth was warm and a single candle burned on a side table. And Marjorie sat in the armchair facing the fireplace. She was older than he remembered, frailer. But her eyes were sharp, watching him like she'd been expecting this moment for years. "You waited too long," she said softly before he could speak. "I didn't know what I was seeing," he answered. Or what it wanted. She didn't look away from the fire. "It doesn't want, Mr. Chambers. It mimics. It studies. It takes shape from attention, from memory, from fear. You looked too long. You gave it shape. How do I stop it?" She shook her head. "You can't. You can only fade before it does." That's how the others lasted. They forgot themselves first. They stopped feeding it. stopped looking into mirrors, stopped being seen. Dorian felt something cold crawl beneath his skin. So I disappear, or it takes me. Marjorie finally looked at him, her expression hard. If it takes you, you become a photo. If you disappear first, you become a ghost. Outside, the wind picked up. Or maybe it was something else moving through the trees, brushing the glass. He whispered, "Then what's the difference?" She leaned closer. A photo gets framed. A ghost keeps running. He sat in Marjorie Holloway's parlor long after the candle had burned down to a bent wick in a dish of wax, listening to the soft crackling of the fireplace and the unsettling way the wind moved through the old shutters. The room seemed still, but not peaceful. It felt suspended, like a page half-turned in a book that didn't want to be read. She hadn't spoken again. Her hands rested quietly on the blanket across her lap, but Dorian noticed how tightly they were clasped, the tendons in her fingers pulled taut as if resisting the urge to tremble. He broke the silence at last. "You said the others lasted by forgetting themselves. What does that even mean?" Marjorie's eyes drifted to a crooked picture frame hanging just above the mantel. It didn't contain a photograph, only a blank sheet of yellowed parchment, as if the image it once held had been removed or erased. "They stopped answering to their names," she said softly. "They stopped looking in mirrors, stopped recognizing their reflections. One teacher wore a blindfold for a year. Another spoke only in third person, until he forgot how to use I. One even burned all the photos of himself, all his childhood drawings, everything, cut pieces of himself from memory, and he survived the longest." Dorian leaned forward, trying to catch every syllable, even though each one weighed heavier than the last. "You're saying it's a game of identity, that it only replaces you if it can finish building you." Marjorie nodded once. "It mimics until the difference is invisible. It learns your rhythm, your voice, your posture. And then it steps in when you're too tired to push back, when you stop noticing the cracks." "But what if I just leave?" he asked. "Drive until I'm somewhere it can't follow." Her silence was answer enough. He stood. The air in the room felt heavier now, thicker, as if the walls were leaning inward, listening. "Then what the hell do I do?" Marjorie finally looked up again, her eyes catching the firelight just enough to glint with something between fear and pity. "You find what it hasn't learned yet, something that still belongs to you, something you've never shown, never said, never written down. Hold on to it like breath, because once it learns everything, it will replace you, not just in the world, but in the memory of everyone who knew you." Dorian turned toward the door, hands shaking. "How long do I have?" She didn't answer right away. Then in a voice so low, it was nearly lost to the fire, "It's already using your smile. You're late, Mr. Chambers." He left without another word. The drive back was emptier than usual. Streetlights flickered in strange patterns. A raccoon stood still in the middle of the road, eyes reflecting the headlights, like twin coins watching him pass without moving. He caught glimpses of his own reflection in every surface, the windshield, the dashboard, the window glass of passing stores, and in every one, the same delay, the same slight curve of lips that didn't quite belong to him. Back at his apartment, the front door stood ajar, not wide open, just enough to show it had been closed politely, just enough to tell him something had entered with purpose. He didn't go inside at first. He stood in the hallway holding his breath, listening. No movement, no sound of creaking floorboards, no whisper of fabric. But the air was cold. Not the chill of an open door, but a deeper cold, like walking into a space that hadn't known warmth in centuries. He stepped inside. Every light was on. The mirror was covered again, but the cloth wasn't the one he'd used. It was cleaner, neater, folded too perfectly at the corners. The books on the shelf had been rearranged by color, not alphabet. His tea mug had been washed and placed on the rack upside down. His toothbrush, never stored upright, now stood in a small glass he didn't own. Something was finishing the job. It wasn't just copying him anymore. It was organizing him, curating him. He backed out slowly, his eyes scanning the corners of the room. He didn't call the police. What would he say? That a phantom version of himself had begun to redecorate? No, he drove back to the school, past midnight again. The building dead quiet. The main entrance still unlocked, perhaps left open by whatever had passed through earlier. He moved through the dark with the cautious memory of someone who'd walked these halls too many times already. And when he reached the east hallway, his breath caught in his throat. The Class 9C photo had returned, framed, centered, perfect. But this time, he wasn't in the middle row anymore. He was in the front, kneeling like a student expression, blank mouth, just barely parted. And behind him, standing straight, dignified, and smiling, was a second version of him. Identical suit, identical posture, but different eyes. These ones were too dark, too deep. And as Dorian stepped closer, he saw it the slightest shimmer behind the glass, like oil on water, swirling in the spaces between students. The photo wasn't still. It was alive. The version of him in the photo turned its head. Not much, just enough, and then it raised its hand and tapped from inside the glass. A soft, muffled sound, once, twice, then a pause, and a third deliberate tap. He staggered back, but the photo didn't end. It followed. His own reflection in the glass shifted slightly, stepping out of alignment with his body, and then it smiled, wider lips stretching almost too far to be human. Dorian turned and ran, not the panicked sprint of prey, but the desperate lurch of someone who realizes they've crossed a threshold they can never come back from. His shoes echoed across the linoleum like gunshots pounding down the empty corridor as the dim emergency lights flickered above him in spasms of dying electricity. Behind him, he didn't hear footsteps. There was no chasing, no breathing. Only a silence so absolute it roared in his ears. He didn't need to look back to know it was following, not physically, but through the images in his mind, through the after-image burned behind his eyes. He didn't stop until he reached the art room, the only place in the entire school where the windows still opened, where natural light had once poured in during class. He slammed the door shut, locked it, and dragged a cabinet in front of it, just for good measure. Then he collapsed onto the floor chest, heaving sweat soaking his shirt. In the stillness, he looked up. Paintings lined the walls, student work mostly forgotten. But all of them had one thing in common now. None of the faces had eyes. Whether pencil sketch, watercolor, or pastel, every pair of eyes had been blacked out. Not slashed or erased, filled in. Methodically, carefully. Each eye now a void, an ink blot abyss staring back, without pupils, without direction. And in the center of the wall, he saw it again. A large canvas he'd never noticed before. A class portrait 9C 2006, but this one was painted, not photographed. And the style was too lifelike, too textured. The kind of realism that could only be captured by someone who had studied the subject for years. But in this version, there were more students than he remembered. 40, maybe 50, arranged in perfect symmetry. Every face eerily calm. And in the center, surrounded by the crowd, stood that same figure again. Tall, blurred, almost faceless now, as if its features had finally worn thin from the strain of too many disguises. But what drew Dorian's gaze, what locked his breath in his throat, was the space beside it. Empty. One gap left, unfilled, a ghostly outline shaped exactly like him, waiting for the last detail to be painted in. Waiting for him. He staggered back and knocked over a jar of charcoal pencils. They spilled across the floor like broken teeth. The shadows in the room deepened with the flickering of the overhead light, as if something unseen had breathed in. The air changed. And then behind him he heard the creak of the cabinet dragging half an inch across the floor. Not fast, not with force, but just enough to shift. Just enough to let something think about coming in. He didn't scream. He moved to the window and forced it open. The cold night air sliced across his skin. He climbed out, dropped the 6 feet to the grass and hit the ground hard, his wrist catching the worst of the fall. He bit back a cry and ran. He didn't look up at the windows, didn't want to know if something was watching. The streets were empty. No headlights, no passing cars. The world felt paused, frozen. He ran until he reached Lila's house. He banged on her door again and again, until a porch light flicked on and her face appeared behind the glass, alarmed and pale. She opened it without asking questions. He collapsed into her hallway, gasping. "It's painting me now," he said. "It's not just photos. It's in everything." She helped him up without speaking, led him to her living room, where the curtains had already been drawn, the mirrors all covered. She knew. Of course she did. "I think it's trying to create something permanent," he whispered. "It wants to make a version of me that can't fade." Something finished. Lila nodded slowly. "It doesn't just copy anymore. It preserves. Once you're painted or captured or remembered too clearly by others, it becomes you to them. And you stop being real in their minds." Dorian looked at his hands, half expecting them to fade. "How do I know I'm still me?" She paused. "Have you noticed time jumping gaps in memory?" He nodded. "Reflections that don't line up." "Yes, voices that sound like yours but wrong, every night." She leaned forward, voice low. "When you have hours, maybe less." He shivered. "What happens when it finishes?" Lila looked away, eyes distant. "Then it steps into the last memory anyone has of you. And from that point on, you become the shadow. You linger. Not alive, not dead. Just a thought fading out behind something that's brighter, sharper, more complete." Dorian pressed his hands to his face. "There has to be a way to stop it." She stared at him for a long moment. "There's one thing," she said finally, "but it's not easy. You have to erase yourself, completely. Every photo, every keepsake. Burn journals, wipe digital records. Make every person forget you ever existed. Because if the world forgets you, so will it. It can't copy what doesn't exist. But it means letting go of everything. Everyone. Even yourself." He stared into the shadows. The thought wrapped around his ribs like barbed wire. Forget who you are, or become a version that never was. He didn't answer right away. The silence between them thickened, stretching across the room like a second presence, one that didn't shift or breathe or blink. It simply existed in the way the shadows did, wrapping around the corners of Lila's living room, soft and waiting. Outside, the wind scraped against the window glass like fingers dragging nails through frost. Dorian stared at the flame of a single candle on the coffee table, watching it dance. Even the light seemed uncertain, flickering too fast as if reacting to something neither of them could see. "Erase myself," he said at last, the words dry and small in his throat. "And what's left? If I forget me, and everyone else forgets me? What's the difference between that and being dead?" Lila didn't answer immediately. Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Death is final," she said softly. "But this is something worse. This is being rewritten. It's not oblivion, it's replacement. There will still be a Dorian Chambers walking around, laughing, teaching, waving at neighbors. But it won't be you. It'll be the version it built from watching you like a taxidermy smile stitched to a mannequin. His stomach turned. How do I even start? He asked, eyes unfocused. Where do you begin to erase yourself? Lila stood. Her movements were purposeful, urgent, as though the time for hesitation had ended. She went into a side drawer and returned with a small weathered journal and a lighter. Start with the photos, she said. Your school files, your ID, your phone's cloud account. Anything that proves you existed. Then your apartment burn anything personal. Notes, old gifts, letters, even your handwriting. After that, it gets harder. You'll need to disappear from people's memories. Stop answering to your name. Don't let them talk about you. Don't let them think about you. It's memory that fuels it. Attention gives it shape. He looked down at his hands again, shaking now, barely his. I don't know if I can. What if I fail halfway through? She didn't meet his gaze. Then you'll still be there, in its eyes, just not in control. That night, they started with his laptop. Dorian sat at Lila's desk while she unplugged the internet, set the phone to airplane mode, and handed him a black marker. They deleted every account, every saved photo, every email. He scrubbed social media until not a trace remained. Even old videos from college, shared clips of class field trips, presentations gone. His face erased like lifting ink off paper. But it wasn't enough. Lila made him print out the few photos she'd taken of him over the years. Birthdays, faculty parties, even a group shot in front of the school gates. One by one, they burned them in her kitchen sink, watching faces curl and blacken into ash. The heat wasn't hot enough to warm the chill in the room. Next came his voice. Recordings from a teaching conference. A short radio interview. An old voicemail he'd left her back when he'd first moved to Belridge. She played it once, just once, and then deleted it. But Dorian had heard something in his own voice before it vanished. A lag. A softness that hadn't been his when he'd recorded it. As though the thing had already started polishing his cadence, smoothing the edges, making his voice easier to wear. Too late, he muttered, staring at the blank screen. It's already better at being me than I am. Lila's hand touched his shoulder, but he flinched without meaning to. His nerves were drawn so tight, they screamed at any contact. I'll help you with the apartment tomorrow, she said. Tonight, stay here. Don't look in mirrors. Don't answer if you hear your own voice outside. That's how it tests the border. He nodded barely. She gave him a blanket, a mug of tea he wouldn't drink, and a place on the couch. The room felt impossibly large and far too small at the same time, as if the walls were both closing in and retreating endlessly. He lay still for hours, unable to sleep, unable to blink without thinking of the figure in the photo, the way it had stepped forward, closer than ever. Just past 3 a.m, the power flickered. It didn't go out, not fully, but the lights dipped low enough to stretch the shadows to unnatural lengths, and the flame of the candle went blue for a heartbeat before returning to normal. Then he heard it, from the hallway, his voice calling softly. Lila. He froze. His breath caught. Across the room, Lila's eyes opened immediately. She hadn't been asleep. She shook her head slowly, silently. Again, the voice came, this time clearer. Hey, it's me, something's wrong, open the door. It was perfect. His inflection, his hesitation, the slight rasp in the back of his throat when he was tired, and yet it wasn't him. He looked at Lila, her eyes filled with fear. Not panic, recognition. She had heard this before. A third knock, then silence. Dorian stood slowly inching toward the door. Not to open it, just to listen, to see if he could hear anything else. His hand hovered over the doorknob palm, sweating, his heart hammering like a trapped moth. He leaned closer, and from the other side, breath brushing wood, he heard it whisper, calm, amused, and far too familiar. You're doing a great job, Dorian. Just a few more pieces to go. Dorian jerked away from the door like it had burned him. The whisper had slithered through the wood, not loud, not overtly threatening, but confident, smooth, as if it had all the time in the world, as if it already knew how this ended. He backed into the living room, heart thudding like war drums in his ears, and saw Lila standing with the fireplace poker gripped in both hands, her face pale but unflinching. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. That voice had stripped away whatever illusion of distance they'd clung to. It was here now, not just watching, participating. The knock didn't come again. Instead, the air itself changed. The kind of pressure drop that signals a coming storm, subtle, invisible, but felt in the bones. The lights flickered once more and didn't come back. A hush fell over the house, thick as velvet. Dorian lit one of the candles. The flame wavered, casting erratic shadows across the room. On the far wall, their silhouettes stretched across the ceiling and floor, but only one of them moved in time with the candlelight. Lila's shadow didn't shift. It stood still, perfectly straight. And then, without either of them moving, it turned its head. Not fast, just enough for him to see it twist toward him. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her back hard. "Don't move," he whispered. Her eyes locked with his. She understood instantly. They stared at the wall as her shadow slowly, fluidly began to smile. The mouth too wide, too dark, stretching open in a jagged arc of silhouette teeth. Then it stepped forward, peeling away from her, sliding across the wall like a second skin detaching itself. That was when the candle went out. Total darkness swallowed them. Dorian didn't scream. Neither did Lila. The terror was so complete, it froze the vocal cords, turned fear into stone. He fumbled in the dark for anything, his bag, the matches, another candle, but the air had thickened, clogged with the smell of damp paper and scorched hair. Then came a sound one he hadn't heard in years, a shutter click, like a vintage camera capturing a still, followed by another, then another. The sound moved through the room from corner to corner as if it were photographing them in the dark, each flash non-existent, but somehow felt as if layers were being peeled from their memories and printed onto something else. Dorian squeezed his eyes shut, trying to picture something real. His childhood bedroom, his mother's voice, the smell of autumn in his old town, anything that still belonged to him. Anything that hadn't been mimicked. And then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. The shadow on the wall was gone. The room looked unchanged. But every picture frame in Lila's house had fallen face down. Every book had turned to the last page. The flame of the candle reignited on its own, small and blue. Lila turned to him. Her voice was hollow. "It's escalating. It's not just trying to copy you now. It's testing who will notice. It's imprinting. One day, someone will mention your name and see it in their mind instead of you. That's how it spreads." Dorian stood slowly, his mind racing. "We need to go. Tonight. Finish burning everything. I'll wipe my apartment, every trace. We finish this before it finishes me." But as he turned to grab his bag, his phone buzzed. He froze. He'd left it behind, in his apartment, face down, powered off. But there it was on Lila's kitchen counter screen, glowing faintly, displaying one single notification: new memories uploaded. Underneath a thumbnail image, the painted version of him, the one from the art room, now fully filled in. He stared at it, the room spinning around him. Lila's voice cut through the fog. "You never brought your phone here." He turned to her. She was already backing away from the counter. And then the phone began to ring, not with his usual tone. Not any tone he recognized, just a low metallic hum like an old film reel unspooling, accompanied by the faint sound of a child giggling, distorted and slowed. He walked to the phone, every instinct screaming, "Don't touch it." But he needed to see, needed to know. The caller ID read, "Mr. Chambers 2. He let it ring. and as it rang, the temperature in the room dropped again. On the third ring, the shadows on the ceiling thickened. On the fifth, Lila said his name, but it didn't sound like her. He turned. She stood completely still, her posture rigid, her head tilted in a way that no human neck should ever allow. Her mouth hung open, jaw slack, but her eyes, they were crying. Her eyes knew. And then, in a voice that had her texture, but not her soul, she whispered, "Almost ready, Mr. Chambers." Just one more reflection. Dorian backed away, every fiber of his body screaming that this was wrong, that the thing standing in front of him wearing Lila's body was no longer the woman who had helped him burn his past. Her lips moved with the same softness. Her posture mimicked that subtle defensive hunch Lila always had when something unsettled her. But the tension was gone. The humanity. Her body was present, but the spirit. The texture of her had slipped out like breath from lungs underwater. "Lila," he said softly, watching her for any sign of response. The thing smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, but appropriately, like a student reciting a facial expression it had studied from thousands of photos. Then it took one step forward, and the air around it rippled ever so slightly, as if the rules of reality were bending to accommodate something that shouldn't exist here. He didn't wait for a second step. He lunged for the phone, not to answer it, but to destroy it. He grabbed it from the counter and hurled it against the floor hard enough to splinter the glass. The screen cracked into a dozen fractures, but it didn't break. The ringing stopped, instantly replaced by a sharp electronic hiss. No words, no static, just a presence trying to squeeze itself through the audio channel, like breathing pressed against a speaker. The lights dimmed to a flicker. Lila's body twitched, spasmed once, and then collapsed like a marionette cut from its strings. He rushed to her side, heart pounding, and caught her just before she hit the ground. Her chest heaved. Her eyes fluttered open, and this time they were hers. She gasped like someone who'd been held underwater. It tried to anchor. Through me. "It's close, Dorian. It's in the house." He looked up. Every reflective surface, every glass photo frame, every dark screen had begun to ripple faintly, like puddles stirred by footsteps just outside sight. It wasn't confined to the mirror anymore. It had found other doors. "It's not just using reflections," Dorian muttered. "It's using memories, phones, paintings, anything that can represent me." That's why the voice sounded like mine. That's why the photo uploaded itself. It's not copying. It's curating. He helped her to the couch, then swept the apartment in a frenzy. He unplugged the TV, flipped every frame, covered each one with cloth. He yanked a throw blanket down over the glass coffee table, turned the stove's chrome surface inward, even wiped down the glossy floor tiles with powdered chalk. The goal wasn't just to stop seeing himself, it was to stop giving it surfaces to emerge from. But it wasn't enough. When he opened the freezer to get ice for Lila's bruised wrist, he saw his own face staring back at him from the frost on the inside wall. Perfectly outlined, as if someone had pressed it there from the other side. The eyes were closed, but not peacefully. Patiently, he slammed the door shut. "It's following too many paths," he said, voice trembling. "Every object that ever held my image, every memory. It's using them to thread itself into the world." Lila looked up. "Then we have to sever them, all of them." Dorian's thoughts spun. The school archives, my student files, old photo yearbooks, the copy machines, the staff board. My landlord has a scanned lease. My credit cards have ID scans. My old passport photo is in a federal database. My image is everywhere. "That's what it wants," she said. "Once there are enough of you out there, it doesn't need you anymore." His eyes snapped to hers. "So we delete me. Everywhere. Not just the apartment. We burn my existence out of every system, every record, every memory. Lila nodded slowly, but her face was grim. We start with the school. They left just before dawn, taking side streets, avoiding intersections with security cameras. The city was too quiet unnaturally, so like the entire neighborhood had paused to watch them move. And above them, every window glinted faintly, with a bluish sheen, as if behind each one sat a version of Dorian waiting. The school was locked, but Lila still had her old janitor keycard. They entered through the east wing where the light was weakest, the walls lined with glass trophies and long abandoned plaques. Dorian averted his eyes, knowing each one could be a portal now. They made for the records room first. Inside, the air was ice cold. Not the kind of chill caused by faulty heating, but the still dead cold of something that didn't breathe. Dorian opened the cabinets, yanked files, yearbooks, scanned ID sheets. He dumped them all in a metal bin and lit them with Lila's Zippo. The fire caught quickly. Pages curled inward like dying leaves. The ink ran. Faces dissolved, and then the screaming started, not aloud, in his mind. A flood of distant voices, his voice overlapping in dozens of registers, high and low and distorted. One said, "You were born on August another. Mr. Chambers, would you please another? You're doing better than you think," and more faster, all of them echoing as if bouncing through a glass tunnel, all vanishing as the fire consumed the records. He fell to his knees, clutching his temples, eyes squeezed shut. Lila grabbed his shoulders, shaking him. "Stay here. Don't follow them." And slowly the noise faded. They looked at the bin. The fire had burned every page, but the metal itself had warped in a strange way, bent outward as if something had tried to claw its way free. Then a creak behind them. The hallway. Dorian turned slowly. In the glass of the trophy cabinet, he saw the entire records room behind him, but not them. Instead, in the reflection, two figures stood motionless. One was him. The other had no face, just a smear of skin stretched across where its features should have been, like clay unshaped, like an unfinished mask. And as he watched, that second figure slowly raised its hand and began to pull its skin open, revealing something darker, something impossibly hungry beneath. Dorian staggered back, his breath hitching in his throat as the figure in the trophy case continued to peel open its false skin. No blood, no bone, just an oily blackness beneath, rippling like tar in a windless void. The shape that emerged wasn't human. It wore the suggestion of a man, but its proportions were slightly off, arms a little too long, shoulders slightly too narrow, as if assembled from a template with no true understanding of what it meant to be. And yet it moved with fluid precision, as if every step, every tilt of its head had been rehearsed 1,000 times. Then it raised one hand, his hand, and placed its palm flat against the inside of the glass. On the other side, Dorian stared at his own reflection, realizing it was perfectly aligned with the creature's gesture. He hesitated, lifting his own hand instinctively, mirroring the movement. And the moment his fingers hovered a breath's width from the surface, the glass rippled, not shattered, not cracked, rippled like water holding a reflection too long. Lila's voice tore through the trance. "Don't touch it." He yanked his hand back, just as the figure lunged forward, not physically, but through the reflection itself. For a fraction of a second, its face pressed into the glass, distorting into a grotesque parody of his features. Lips stretched, eyes blank, a too wide smile, like a wound that had never healed. Dorian grabbed Lila's hand. "We can't destroy just the records. We have to get to the original source, the first copy. The original class photo." Lila blinked. "It's in the basement vault, the archive sublevel. They digitized it, but the real one, the film, the print, is locked down there." They ran through the east stairwell, bypassing the main halls where too many mirrors and framed photos now gleamed with unnatural clarity. Even the scuffed linoleum tiles seemed to hold faint reflections if they looked long enough. Dorian caught flashes of himself or something, almost like him stepping in rhythm just a half beat behind. The basement door had a keypad lock. He slammed his palm against it. "Do you know the code?" "I used to," Lila said, eyes narrowing. "Try 09132006. It clicked. The door opened to darkness. A heavy, almost wet cold drifted up the stairwell. They descended each step, creaking as if resisting their weight, as if the building itself no longer wanted them to proceed. The lights were motion-triggered, but only half flickered on, leaving long patches of shadow between each cold fluorescent hum. At the bottom, they found the archive vault, a steel door with a sliding observation window fogged from the inside. Lila swore under her breath. No one's been down here in years. Dorian pulled the lever. The lock hissed, then released with a reluctant clang. The door opened. The room beyond was filled with filing cabinets, sealed boxes, microfilm readers, and in the center, sitting on a cloth-draped pedestal beneath a cracked overhead light, was a single black and white photograph in a wooden frame. The Class 9C photo. Unmistakable, unaged. Dorian stepped forward, pulse in his throat. The faces were clearer than he remembered. Sharper, but wrong. Their expressions were frozen in a kind of serene indifference, like people who'd seen the end of everything and accepted it. Each student stared directly at the lens, except one, his own face, eyes closed, smiling, his head tilted just enough to suggest awareness, like he'd blinked a moment before the shutter snapped and hadn't quite recovered. But what truly chilled him was the gap. At the end of the second row, there was a sliver of space empty, but clearly meant for someone. The edges were too precise. Not a misprint. A placeholder. For him, the version of him that hadn't yet been fully claimed. Lila approached her breath, fogging in the freezing air. "Destroying this won't stop the digital copies," she whispered. "But this is where it started. This is the seed." Dorian reached for the frame, but before his fingers touched the wood, the photo shuddered. A pulse of static-like energy rippled across the surface, and for a heartbeat, every face in the picture turned their gaze to him, not just the printed eyes, the awareness behind them. The photo was alive. Lila hissed, backing up. "It's not an image, it's a vessel. I don't care." He grabbed the frame and smashed it against the concrete wall. Glass exploded. The wood cracked. The print tumbled to the floor, face up, untouched. Not a tear, not a wrinkle. It was still perfect. No, perfect. Now in that once empty spot, a face had formed. His, new, eyes open, mouth curved into a smile he hadn't made yet. Lila stepped beside him, voice shaking. "It doesn't need you to pose anymore. It's already finished the version it wants." Dorian's mouth went dry. "Then why am I still here?" A voice from behind them answered. Smooth, measured, identical to his own. "Because you haven't signed off yet." They turned. Standing in the doorway was him, but not tired, not afraid. He was pristine, hair combed, shirt ironed, shoes spotless, and he smiled not cruelly, but politely, like a teacher meeting a parent. "I need you," the double said, stepping forward to accept. And as it reached out a hand, Dorian realized it wasn't going to take him by force. It wanted him to agree, to let go, to merge. Dorian didn't move. His muscles locked not from fear, but from the suffocating realization that what stood before him was no longer just a copy, it was a culmination. The man before him wasn't pretending to be Dorian Chambers. He believed he was. His tone, his stance, even the way his eyes softened at the corners when he spoke. It was him, polished down to the last imperfection, but hollow in all the places that mattered. The double stepped further into the room, careful, measured steps that didn't echo. "It doesn't have to be painful," it said, the voice so familiar it hurt. "You've done the hard part already. Erased yourself, removed all conflict, cleared the way. All that's left is to step aside." Lila gripped Dorian's arm, whispering urgently, "Don't listen. That thing can't become you unless you let it. The last piece it needs is your consent. The double tilted its head. Consent is a human word, a human concept. But let's not pretend this is about resistance. You're tired. You've felt the erosion. You've looked into the mirror and not seen yourself for days. That was me. Softly, carefully, replacing weight with light, noise with silence, fear with understanding. Isn't that what you wanted, Mr. Chambers' peace? Peace isn't silence, Dorian said hoarsely. It's presence. And you've stripped me of mine. The smile didn't falter. No. I've preserved you. What you are, what you were, is being curated. Perfected. People will remember you fondly, respectfully. They'll say you were the best version of yourself. Because I am. Dorian shook his head. No. They'll remember what you made them remember. The double's expression changed just for a moment. A flicker of impatience. Like a sculptor tired of chipping stone. You're clinging to a decaying self, it said. You think that's noble? It's not. It's inefficient. And then it reached into its coat pocket, pulled out a mirror. Handheld, bolt, the kind they used in dressing rooms lined with chipped silver. It held it up, not toward Dorian, but toward itself. And what stared back from the mirror wasn't Dorian at all. It was a blank silhouette. No face, no form. Just a shifting smudge of memory. A blur where an identity should be. But as the double stared into it, details began to form. One eye, then a nose, a familiar tilt of chin. The more it looked, the more complete the reflection became. Lila gasped. It's pulling you out through memory. The double extended the mirror toward Dorian. Just look. One glance. One blink. That's all I need. Then the weight will lift. The confusion. The fear. You'll drift into something quieter. Dorian's body tensed, because in that moment every tired cell in him wanted it to be done, to fade into stillness, to let the memories that twisted around his soul finally dissolve. But then he remembered something, a scrap of a thought nearly lost in the blur of recent days. The child's laugh, his niece, Ava. She had drawn him a picture once, crude bright with crayons smeared across wrinkled paper. This is you, she'd said, holding it up proudly. The drawing didn't look like him at all. The proportions were all wrong. His hair was green, but it was him through her eyes, her joy. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't curated. It was authentic. That was the difference. That was what the thing in front of him could never steal. Not a perfect image, but an imperfect love. Dorian stepped forward. The double's expression brightened. It extended the mirror. Dorian reached for it. Then, at the last second, he slammed it to the ground. Glass exploded. The mirror fractured into shards, light scattering across the concrete like frozen lightning. The image inside screamed a high metallic shriek, like metal tearing, but the double didn't flinch. It simply stood straighter, as if relieved. You've made your choice, it said. And with that, the lights in the archive died. Pitch black. Dorian grabbed Lila's hand. Run. They bolted through the dark, sprinting blind. The hallway twisted. Behind them, something chased, but not with footsteps. With echoes. Words they hadn't spoken. Laughter they hadn't shared. Sounds they'd forgotten, now repurposed to lure them back. They made it to the stairs. Light poured in from the main floor above, but as Dorian turned to climb, he saw them. Dozens of copies, walking down the stairs, all of them him, some older, some younger, some in outfits he hadn't worn in years, but all with the same look, calm, assured, smiling. Waiting for him to choose, Dorian froze halfway up the steps, caught between the familiar and the impossible. They were descending with methodical slowness, a silent procession of his own face, his own posture, his own history, all converging like reflections caught in shattered glass, stitched together from scattered years. One wore the old denim jacket he'd lost in college. Another had the lopsided haircut from a summer trip to Italy. One version still bore the youthful flush of his early 20s eyes wide with naive ambition. Another, far worse, was dressed in the clothes he'd worn yesterday. Each face smiled the same way. Not menacing, not welcoming, but inevitable. Lila's hand pulled at his sleeve. "We can't go back," she whispered, her voice raw. "And we can't go forward unless we choose which one to leave behind." He turned to her. "What? They're memories, Dorian. Projections. You're at the center of too many versions of yourself, and it's thinning your reality. If you carry them all, they'll drown you. You have to decide who you really are and let the others collapse." But he couldn't think. The pressure was mounting inside his skull, behind his ribs, a rising swell of emotion and noise. The staircase pulsed with quiet tension. He looked down and saw the concrete cracking beneath his feet, like thin ice. Time was unraveling, slipping sideways, merging layers of self that had never been meant to meet. One of the double's barefoot, pale eyes, too bright, reached out a hand. "We're all you," it said softly. "Just pick one. It won't hurt. You'll still be real. Just easier to remember." Dorian felt his mind pulling in 1,000 directions at once. Faces blurred. Moments collided. The day he first taught a class. The night he wept alone in his car after a funeral. The time he laughed so hard he cried at a student's joke. The shame, the triumph, the silence, the chaos. "I don't want to forget," he murmured. "Even the broken parts, even the worst days. They're mine." The staircase shifted. A low hum began vibrating through the stone walls, not sound, but pressure, like a storm just over the hill. Lila squeezed his hand tighter. "You don't need to forget," she said. "You just need to anchor." He understood. He had to define himself not by the scattered memories others held, but by a singular truth only he could choose. A moment, a thought, an emotion that was his, not anyone else's interpretation. His mind searched, and it found it. Not the proudest day, not the saddest, but the quiet moment in his classroom months ago, when he sat alone after all the students had left. The sun filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long golden lines across his desk. He'd leaned back utterly still, listening to the faint hum of the school's old radiator. And in that silence, he'd felt peaceful. Not successful, not special, just present. That was who he was, the version that needed no witness. He took a step forward. The doubles paused. Another step, and they began to blur their outlines, fuzzing like static in an analog TV, as though reality itself was rejecting them. He walked through them, and as he did, each one shattered not in blood or violence, but in disappearance. One by one they unraveled into dust, their smiles the last to vanish. He reached the top of the stairs, Lila close behind. They stepped into the light of the main hallway, gasping like survivors breaking the surface after nearly drowning. The school above felt different now, emptier but clearer, like fog lifting from the edges of his mind. But it wasn't over. Not yet. In the center of the corridor, lit only by the dull flicker of an overhead bulb, stood the final version. It was perfect, tall, clean, composed. And in its hand it held something small and impossibly delicate. A memory sphere, glass smooth and glowing faintly with a light that wasn't natural. Dorian stared. "What is that?" he asked. The double smiled, not with warmth, but with deep satisfaction. "Your signature," it said. "Everything you've forgotten, everything you've tried to erase, condensed into one crystallized thought. If you take it, it's done. You'll be archived. And if I don't," the smile faltered, "you'll break," the thing whispered. "No one survives unanchored. Not when they've been unmade this far." Dorian reached toward the sphere. Then at the last second he pulled back and smashed it from the double's hand. The sphere shattered on the linoleum. A blast of sound erupted. Laughter, sobbing screams, music, echoes of footsteps, voices from every hallway he'd ever walked. Light exploded from the fragments, casting fractured memories across the walls, ceiling, and floor like stained glass. The double stumbled. Its face began to flicker, one moment smiling, the next, gone. Its form collapsed in on itself, pulling inward like a collapsing lung, like film melting in a projector too hot to hold it. It let out one last distorted gasp and vanished. The hallway went still. No shadows, no whispers. Just Dorian and Lila standing in the quiet wreckage of what had almost replaced him. Lila exhaled. "You did it." He didn't answer, because deep inside him, beneath the calm, something still stirred. Not malevolent, not familiar, just waiting. Dorian stood amid the silence, ears ringing with the ghost of that final sound part. Scream part, sigh part, whisper of something ancient surrendering. The air had changed. It no longer pressed on his lungs like wet cotton, no longer shimmered with the tension of being watched. The hallway was still almost serene, but beneath that stillness lay a nervous hum in his chest, the kind that lingered after lightning had struck too close. It wasn't over, not fully. What vanished had been the shape of the vessel, but the force that shaped it, the intelligence behind the mimicry, the hunger that drove it, that had only been pushed back, not destroyed. Lila lowered herself to the floor, breathing hard. Her hair clung to her face, soaked with sweat, her clothes dusted with flecks of shattered glass from the memory sphere. "We need to leave," she said. "Not just the school, the town, everything connected to it." But Dorian shook his head slowly. "We burned the photos, erased the files, broke the projection, but there's still one thing left." He turned to face her. "Me," Lila frowned. "What do you mean?" "Everything we destroyed was external," he said, pacing now, unable to keep still. "But the root of it, the reason it chose me is inside. My memories, my regret, my need to be understood, seen. That thing, whatever it is, it didn't pick me randomly. It fed on the version of me I presented to the world, the curated image. It learned from it. But what it really clung to was my desire to be more than that." "Dorian." "No," he interrupted. "Think about it. Every time it advanced, it did so by perfecting a version of me I once wished I could be. Better spoken, more confident, more respected. It grew not by watching me, but by absorbing every mask I ever wore." Lila's expression hardened. "So what are you saying? That you're still feeding it?" "I'm saying," he replied, voice low, "that as long as I'm alive, it still has an anchor." The idea hung in the air like smoke. Lila stood abruptly. "No, I don't accept that. We've come too far, which is exactly why I need to finish it," he said. "Not just run, not hide, end it. And I think I know how." He walked to the nearest classroom, room 2B, his old homeroom, and pushed the door open. It groaned softly on its hinges. Inside, the desks were still neatly arranged, the chalkboard faintly marked with leftover formulas and scribbles. Dust motes swirled in the golden light spilling through the blinds. It looked normal, familiar. But something in Dorian's gut twisted, because this room was where it had begun. The class photo had been taken here, right at the front beneath the school crest. He walked to the exact spot, placed his hand against the peeling wallpaper. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wall shimmered, like oil across water. Lila gasped. He turned to her. "It's a gate, not to another place, but to a moment." The moment it entered, the shimmer deepened, and behind it the faint outline of a younger Dorian appeared, seated at his desk, unaware. A camera sat on a tripod nearby. A teacher gave instructions off-frame. It was a loop, a memory, a slice of time replaying trapped. "You can't go in there," Lila said. "That's not time travel. That's absorption. If you step in, it'll trap you. make you part of it, unless I break the loop from the inside," he said, voice calm now. Resigned. "If I find the exact point where I let it in, where I wished for something else, maybe I can seal it. Collapse the false self from within." "You're talking about erasing your own origin," she whispered. "You could lose everything, every part of you." He met her eyes. "Or I could lose everyone if I don't." The shimmer pulsed again. Behind the glassy veil, the younger Dorian turned slightly, almost as if sensing him. Lila stepped forward, grabbed his wrist. "If you go in, I won't be able to follow." He smiled sadly. "Then remember me for real. Not perfect, not polished. Just me." And before she could stop him, he stepped into the memory. The world folded inward. The air grew heavy like syrup, like sleep. He felt himself compress, thoughts pulled tight. Time lost structure. There were no seconds, just moments, pulses, impressions. And then he was inside, seated at the desk. The room full of light and laughter. Students around him chatting, passing notes. The old teacher, Mr. Callahan, clearing his throat and asking them to settle down for the class photo. It felt so real, but Dorian knew better. He stood up, scanning the room, searching for the anomaly. And there it was, in the back row against the window, a student who wasn't in that class. No name, no books, no laughter, just a still figure, smiling too calmly, watching him, not the camera, him. Dorian walked down the aisle, students ignoring him completely as if he didn't exist here. Only that one figure watched, its eyes locked on his. And when Dorian stopped in front of it, the thing stood slowly. No features, just the suggestion of them. And it whispered with his voice, "You came back for yourself?" And Dorian whispered in return, "No, I came to end you." The classroom dissolved around them like mist fleeing the morning sun. Desks melted into shadow. The chatter of students faded into a low-frequency hum, and the artificial light streaming through the windows darkened into a cold, colorless glow. Dorian found himself standing on a floor that no longer had texture, only an impression of surface. The entity, his hollow twin, stood opposite him now, no longer pretending to be a classmate, no longer mimicking anyone. It had shed the skin of imitation and stood in its purest form, a silhouette outlined in barely there light, its edges twitching like static on a dead channel. "You came to erase," the figure said, "but you are the source." Dorian took a step forward, boots clicking on nothing. "Then let me speak to the source, not the echo, not the shadow. You." The thing tilted its head. "I am not separate. I am the part you left unclaimed, the want, the false light, the piece of you that needed to be seen. I grew in the silence between who you were and who you pretended to be." He stared at it, breathing steady now. "Then I'll claim it, all of it. I'll accept what I tried to bury and leave no room for you." The shape pulsed once and then expanded. The darkness flared outward, surrounding him, wrapping him in folds of memory that weren't real, yet felt deeply familiar. 1,000 alternate lives whispered in his ears. One where he became the admired professor. Another where he was a recluse painter in Paris. A best-selling author. A beloved mentor. A tragic figure mourned by millions. The entity offered them like a library of alternate timelines, each one carefully curated to appeal to some forgotten version of him. "You can choose," it murmured. "Be any of these. Let the world hold you in high regard. Let them remember the version of you that mattered." But Dorian wasn't tempted now, because he saw what they all had in common. None of them were real. Every version was sanitized, beautiful, aching with unearned significance. There were no days of self-doubt, no nights staring at the ceiling paralyzed by indecision, no small joys, no mundane routines, no flaws. They were empty portraits in golden frames. He took a breath, raised his voice over the choir of illusions. "I was afraid of being forgotten," he said. That's why you grew. That's where you were born. But I'd rather be forgotten honestly than remembered wrong. The darkness around him flinched. The silhouettes began to distort. The perfect versions began to scream, not with mouths, but with collapse. Their frames cracked. Their limbs stretched. Their bodies unraveled, not into blood or bone, but into strips of film peeling off and vanishing into lightless space. The core figure, the original Echo, staggered, its voice warped. You need me to be remembered. I hold your meaning. No, Dorian said softly, stepping forward. You hold my fear. And with that, he reached inside himself, not physically, but through memory, and conjured one image. Not a masterpiece, not a portrait, just a worn, creased photograph his mother once took of him and his sister, sitting on a swing, both of them sunburned and smiling with teeth too big for their faces. It was off-center, poorly lit, real. He released it into the dark, and the darkness recoiled. The light from the memory expanded like fire spilling through dry leaves. It tore through the illusions, burning every curated life to ash. The shadow entity screamed a sound that wasn't rage, but despair. Not rejection. Abandonment. It had no power outside the performance. Dorian stood tall, the fire of truth pushing outward from his chest, not blinding, but illuminating. I don't need you anymore, he said. The figure collapsed inward. Its form imploded, drawn into a single pinprick of shadow that collapsed in on itself with a whisper, like a dying wind. Silence fell, and then, for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, Dorian heard something simple, something clean, a heartbeat, his own. The space around him grew lighter, more defined. The mist dissolved, revealing the familiar edges of room 2B. Dust motes hung in the sunlight again. The desk in front of him was scratched and chipped, the air filled with the dry scent of chalk and old wood. He was back, for real. No voices echoed, no shadows moved. He turned toward the doorway, and Lila was standing there. Her eyes welled up relief and disbelief, warping her features. You did it, she whispered. He walked to her each step, grounded each breath solid. He passed the threshold and felt it like stepping out of a dream that had lasted too long. She touched his shoulder. Are you all here? He nodded. I think for the first time I actually am, but deep inside he knew something else. The thing was gone, but its impression remained. Not in the world. In him, like the ghost of a scar. Not dangerous, but unforgettable. They walked out of the school in silence, the morning sun beginning to rise behind the skeletal trees lining the courtyard. It was the same light as always, pale, indifferent. But this time, it didn't feel cold. Dorian let it settle on his skin, as though relearning the sensation of warmth. Each step echoed softly across the concrete, and with every footfall, the weight in his chest seemed to dissipate, not vanishing completely, but diffusing into something bearable. Lila stayed close, her eyes darting across the empty parking lot as if still expecting to see another version of him step from behind a car, smiling that false, gentle smile. But the air was quiet. No mirrors shimmered, no voices whispered. The world felt like itself again, messy, cracked human. As they reached the sidewalk, Dorian glanced back at the school building one last time. The windows reflected only sky now. No figures, no mimicry, just ordinary light. He nodded once, then turned his back to it. They walked in the direction of the metro station, weaving through familiar streets past shuttered shops and flickering street lamps. The city was just waking up, unaware of what had unfolded during the hours of stillness. Cars passed. A jogger with headphones nodded absently. A bakery lifted its metal gate, the scent of rising dough drifting into the street. The world kept moving, and yet something had shifted. Do you think it's really over? Lila asked, her voice soft, almost tentative. Dorian didn't answer immediately. He watched as a bird landed on a lamppost above them, fluttered, then took off again. Over, he repeated. Maybe. The thing, that version of me, it's gone. The loop is broken. But it didn't create itself out of nothing. It came from what I fed it. Lila slowed her steps. You mean your need to be remembered, to be seen, Dorian corrected gently. We all want to matter, be more than just shadows in other people's stories. But the more we curate ourselves, the more we risk losing the parts that are real. That thing, it was a parasite, yes. But I opened the door. They reached the metro entrance, the stairs leading down into dim, flickering light. Lila stopped. So what now? You disappear. Go off the grid, burn the last traces of yourself. He looked at her then down the tunnel. The idea of vanishing was tempting. No records, no reflections, no past. But even that especially, that was just another version of the lie. Running wasn't the answer. Not anymore. I go back, he said simply, not to hide, to live. Lila raised an eyebrow. Back where there's no school, you quit. People think you had a breakdown. Dorian smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. Then I show them I'm still here, that I'm not a ghost, not a legend. Just a man who got lost for a while. They stood there a moment longer before she gave a short laugh. God, you really are stubborn. It's part of the charm, he said, and started down the steps. The train platform was quiet, a single fluorescent bulb flickering above the tracks. As they waited, Dorian pulled out his phone and without hesitation opened the camera. He flipped it to selfie mode. His own face stared back at him, tired, unshaven, faint lines around the eyes, but undeniably his. No distortion, no perfect symmetry, no echo in the background, just Dorian. He took a photo. Lila looked at him like he was mad. You're taking selfies now. I'm reclaiming the frame, he said. The train roared into the station, stirring dust and warmth. As the doors opened and they stepped inside, he knew it wasn't truly the end. The world was still full of surfaces, still full of moments that could twist into reflections if he wasn't careful. But he had something stronger now than fear. He had memory, not the curated kind, but the messy, honest, raw version that couldn't be copied. And that made all the difference. As the train pulled away, Dorian leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to remember on his own terms. The train ride stretched on through the early morning hush windows fogged at the corners, each car bathed in a faint amber light that made the world outside feel dreamlike. Dorian sat with his hands folded on his lap, eyes open, but unfocused, watching the tunnel lights flash in rhythmic bursts. Lila sat across from him, legs crossed, fiddling with a loose thread on her jacket. Neither spoke for a long while. Words didn't feel necessary now. Not yet. Somewhere around the fifth stop, a child boarded with his mother dragging a balloon tied to his wrist. The boy looked at Dorian curiously, then smiled without a word. Dorian smiled back. Just a small thing, an ordinary interaction. But it felt new, real. He realized how starved he had been for moments that weren't filtered through the lens of fear or performance. There had been so much pretending in his life at work, with friends, even in private moments. And somewhere along the way, something else had slipped in and taken root. Something that grew stronger every time he revised who he was for others. The mimicry had never started as supernatural. It had started as habit. And that he now understood had been the first invitation, I think he said quietly. I spent so long building versions of myself that I forgot none of them were me. Not really. I was performing grief, performing passion, even performing silence. Lila didn't look up, but her voice was gentle. You're not alone in that. He nodded. I know, that's what scares me. The train slowed. A flickering sign flashed Morningside Central. This wasn't their destination, but it was the first place Dorian had lived after college. He hadn't been back in years. The streets above this station held memories. First jobs, bad dates, long walks with nothing in his pocket but hope and self-doubt. As the doors opened, he stood up. Lila frowned. "What's here?" "I need to see something." She didn't question him, just followed. The streets were familiar in the way old shoes are familiar. Worn, cracked, a little sad, but shaped by memory. They passed the cafe where he used to mark papers, the bookstore that smelled like ink and mildew, the lamppost he once leaned against for an hour in the rain, too afraid to knock on a door that never opened. It wasn't nostalgia that pulled him here. It was something else, a need to see the unremarkable, the pieces of his life no one else would remember. Places that didn't exist in photos, moments that weren't performed, just his untouched. They reached a small apartment complex with green-painted balconies and a broken intercom. Dorian stood outside it, staring up at the third floor. "That was me," he said, eating cold noodles out of a pot, falling asleep with textbooks open on my chest, laughing at nothing, crying at nothing. Lila looked up at the same windows. "You think it started here?" He shook his head. "I think I started here. Before the curation. Before I tried to fix the parts of me that were never broken." A breeze passed between them, cool and dry. A dog barked somewhere far off. And then faintly from the apartment above, a sound floated through the air, a melody. Someone playing piano. Not well, but sincerely. Dorian smiled. "It's still here. The realness." Lila touched his shoulder. "Then don't forget it again." They lingered a moment longer before turning away, letting the past stand behind them like an old photograph, folded in a drawer, still there but no longer looming. By the time they returned to the train station, the city had brightened. Not fully awake, but stirring. And in that gray space between night and day, Dorian made a decision. "Let's go to the press," he said. Lila blinked. "What? Not tabloids? Not social media? Just a simple interview. One publication. The truth. No drama. No mystery. Just the facts. About what happened. What we stopped. No embellishment." Lila studied his face, then nodded slowly. "And if they don't believe you, they don't need to," he said. "I just need to speak it aloud. That's the last piece. Telling the story not to be remembered, but to remember myself." As they boarded the next train, Dorian felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but genuine. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The offices of the Morningside Record were nestled in the upper floor of a brick building that had once housed a tailor shop. The stairs creaked with every step as Dorian and Lila ascended, the kind of sound that stuck in memory, even when everything else faded. When they reached the landing, a dusty bell above the door gave a tired jingle. Inside the newsroom was quiet, half lit by dusty fluorescent panels, and the soft gray light bleeding in through narrow windows. A single journalist sat typing at a cluttered desk, his sleeves rolled up, and a pen tucked behind one ear, surrounded by stacks of paper, empty coffee cups, and the gentle hum of a radio tuned to white noise. He looked up when they entered. Dorian recognized him immediately. Tobias Finch, veteran reporter, local legend, the kind of man who had watched the world crumble in headlines and still printed truth in lowercase letters. He didn't smile, just squinted, then gestured them in with emotion that somehow felt both dismissive and curious. "You're late," Tobias said, though. No appointment had been made. But then again, stories like yours never show up when they're supposed to. "Sit." Dorian sat Lila beside him, her hand still wrapped around the strap of her bag, like she expected it to be snatched away. Finch leaned forward. "I've heard whispers. People disappearing from school photos. Shadows walking hallways. And your name always floats near the top. But no one talks. They just forget. Like it's smoke." You here to clear the air?" Dorian nodded once. "Off the record, I'll tell you everything. On the record, I want one thing: publish the truth. No embellishments, no dramatic flair. Just what happened. What almost happened. And how it ended." Tobias studied him. "You understand that printing it won't make you look sane. It won't repair your reputation. It'll make you into something worse than a fraud. A warning." "I know," Dorian said. "That's fine." He began to speak, slowly at first, carefully. He told Finch about the photo, the first anomaly, the shift in the angle of his own head, the extra student, the missing names. He explained the distortions in memory, the flickering images, the way his reflection would sometimes speak before he moved. He described the growing presence, the copies, the confrontation inside the memory, and the final collapse. Finch didn't write any of it down. He just listened. As the story unfolded, his expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. Not belief, not skepticism, but recognition. Like a man hearing a tune he hadn't heard since childhood, played off key but still familiar. When Dorian finished, silence settled over the room. Finch walked over to the window and pulled the cord on the blinds. Slats of late morning sun sliced across the wall like prison bars. "You think it's gone?" he asked. "I think I'm not feeding it anymore," Dorian said. "That might be enough." Finch turned slowly. "That's the part they never understand, you know. The ghosts, the demons, the things that wear our faces, they don't need rituals. They need attention. They need us." He walked back to the desk, picked up an old typewriter, one of the few that still worked, and rolled in a clean sheet of paper. "One page," he said. "Clean. No metaphors, no fancy language. Just the facts." Dorian nodded. Lila exhaled. "You sure you want this out in the world?" "Yes," Dorian said, "because people need to understand the danger isn't in being haunted. It's in forgetting who you really are." Finch began to type. The sound was rhythmic grounding, letters clacking into permanence. Dorian sat back, watching the words form, not needing to see them. He already knew what they said, and more importantly, he knew what they meant. This wasn't an exorcism, not a cleansing. It was a statement, a stake in the ground, proof that even if no one believed him, even if the world called him mad, he had spoken the truth. When Finch finished, he tore the paper free, folded it in thirds, and slid it into an envelope. "Go home," he said. "I'll do the rest." Dorian rose. "Thank you." But as he turned to leave, Finch added one final word. "Careful with mirrors." The door closed behind them, and outside the sun had broken fully through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, the world looked unaltered, but both of them knew something had listened. The next morning, the article was published in a small corner of the paper with a simple title: "A Man, a Memory, a Mirror." It wasn't on the front page. It wasn't even given a headline font. But it was there, tucked between a local crime report and an obituary, sitting in plain sight for anyone who happened to pause long enough to notice. The article didn't mention Dorian's name. It didn't describe the entity or the horror that nearly consumed him. It didn't have to. What it did was pose a quiet warning wrapped in ordinary language. There are reflections that don't wait for mirrors. Sometimes they start inside. By noon, the calls began. A woman from Westchester said she had seen her son's face flicker in a family photo twice. A high school janitor reported catching his own reflection doing something his body hadn't. Someone else wrote in to say that for months, he'd felt like his memories had a version of himself that was slightly more charming, slightly more loved, and yet completely unrecognizable. The city didn't spiral into panic. Most dismissed the article as fiction, some kind of therapeutic art piece, an attempt to make meaning from the burnout of a teacher who had gone silent too long. But others knew, quietly, deeply. They knew something had brushed past them in their lives, something they had always explained away. And now they hesitated, in doorways, in front of cameras, in front of glass. Back in his apartment, Dorian sat by the window and watched people pass. He was holding a letter, unsigned, unmarked, just a sheet of notebook paper slipped under his door sometime during the night. It read, "I was in the photo too, but no one remembers me. Tell me how you got out." There was no return address, no name. He folded the note and tucked it in a drawer filled with old receipts and faded postcards. He didn't know if the writer was real or just another echo trying to pull him back into the loop. But it didn't matter. The only response he owed now was to live honestly. Lila visited that afternoon. She brought soup and old books, the kind with frayed pages and long-winded footnotes. She flopped onto his couch without ceremony, unwrapped a sandwich, and handed him half. "I read the comments," she said, chewing. "Some people think you're a cult leader now. One guy said you're the avatar of postmodern grief," Dorian snorted. "That's better than delusional ex-educator," she grinned. "You've got options." They fell into a comfortable quiet, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Outside, clouds drifted across a slowly reddening sky. Inside, the air was warm, grounded by the smell of bread and books, and something else, something Dorian hadn't felt in weeks. Stillness, not numbness, not emptiness, but the calm that comes after a storm has truly passed. When the wind stops rattling the windows and the silence isn't ominous, just present. "I don't think it's done," Lila said eventually. "I know," Dorian replied. They both looked at the bookshelf where one frame remained turned backward. Dorian hadn't touched it. He wasn't afraid of what was in the frame anymore. He simply didn't need to look. "It'll come back," she said. "Not the same way. Not with your face, but it'll find someone else." "Then I hope they have someone like you," he said quietly, "to believe them before they forget who they are." She looked away, suddenly shy. Moments later, she stood and walked over to the turned frame. She hesitated, then slowly flipped it around. The photo inside was blank. No faces, no shadows, just the faded outline of what had once been. "Erased?" she asked. "No," Dorian said, joining her. "Released." They stood there side by side, watching nothing at all. And for now, that was enough. It was 3 weeks before Dorian saw another flicker. He'd started walking every morning, not far, just down to the park, a few laps near the fountain and back. A quiet ritual. Movement, breath reflection. Something to reconnect him to the world without screens or filtered thoughts. He didn't carry his phone anymore. Not often. Not unless he had to. Technology with its glass and glare had become too uncertain. Too much like bait. That morning the path was damp from a light rain, and the trees lining the edge of the park still dripped gently onto the stone benches below. He walked alone, jacket zipped to the collar, hands deep in his pockets. He wasn't looking for signs. He wasn't thinking about the thing he'd left behind. But sometimes the past doesn't knock at seeps. He stopped by the fountain. The water was still unchurned. No wind, no ripples, just a perfect mirror. And in its reflection, someone sat on the opposite bench, a man in gray. Dorian turned around quickly. Nothing. The bench was empty. He looked back down. The man was still there in the reflection only. He didn't move, didn't shift, just sat. Dorian crouched by the edge of the fountain, staring into that still surface. The image held sharp as a knife's edge. The figure wore no defining features, just the vague imprint of a man. No face, no hands. A silhouette filled with the same colorless gray of forgotten memories. Then slowly the figure raised its hand. A wave. Dorian didn't respond. Instead he whispered, "You're not me." The figure's head tilted slightly, but it didn't vanish. It didn't scream or burst into flames or melt. It simply stayed like an idea that refuses to die even when you no longer believe in it. And then beneath the reflection, something new began to form. Not a face, not a body, a name. It began to write itself across the water's surface in trembling script. Ellis. The name meant nothing to Dorian. Not yet. But the figure slowly lowered its hand, stood, and walked out of frame, not on land, but within the reflection. Its shadow drifted out of sight like a cloud slipping behind a mountain. The water rippled, and then it was gone. Dorian remained crouched for a moment longer. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small notebook one Lila had given him after the interview, embossed with gold stars on the cover, like a child's journal. For fragments, she had said, not facts, just things worth remembering. He opened to the first blank page and wrote Ellis. In the fountain seen only in reflection. Not me. Not the echo. Something new. Then he closed the book and stood. He didn't feel afraid. Not this time. He didn't know who Ellis was. A name. A beginning. Maybe a person still trapped in some reflection. Maybe the next shape of the thing. Maybe something else entirely. But what mattered most was this. The echo hadn't returned in his face. It had moved on. That terrified him, yes. But it also meant that something in him had finally broken the loop. As he walked home, he saw the world with strange clarity. He noticed how many windows he passed, how many surfaces were reflective. The glint of a car hood, the shimmer of a bus mirror, a rain puddle with just enough depth to show your eyes, but none of your soul. The world was built for watching and being watched, and that meant the thing, whatever it had been, would always have doorways. He needed to be ready, not to fight it, but to help whoever came next. Back in his apartment, he cleared off the small desk in the corner and placed the journal there beside a fresh stack of envelopes, a cup of tea cooling beside them. He would write letters, not to Ellis, to strangers, to the ones who might one day find themselves wondering why their reflection doesn't blink at the same time they do. Not a guidebook, not a warning, just the truth written gently without judgment. A voice in the dark saying, "You're not crazy. You're not alone. You can survive this." The letters started small, a handful each week, written late at night in the hush of a city winding down. Dorian kept them brief, never more than a page. No wild claims, no talk of demons or possessed cameras or mirror dimensions, just soft, probing questions like, have you ever felt like someone else wore your smile better than you did? Or, when was the last time you looked at yourself and truly remembered the version you used to be? He addressed them generically, to the one who wonders, or to the one behind the glass. Then, with Lila's help, he started mailing them. Slipped into library books tucked beneath the windshields of parked cars left folded and anonymous on cafe tables or pinned to corkboards at community centers. He didn't sign them. There was no sender, no request for reply. They were offerings, nothing more. And slowly over the weeks that followed, they began to echo back. At first it was whispers, a torn scrap of notebook paper returned under his apartment door. I thought I was the only one who remembered the extra girl in our wedding photos, then a postcard taped to his mailbox. He walks behind me in reflections. He doesn't wave, but I know he's waiting. Soon, Dorian's drawer filled with answers. Drawings, poems, typed sheets riddled with corrections. Most didn't name the thing they'd seen, but they all felt the same. The uncanny recognition, the subtle unraveling of self, that cold moment when you begin to realize your life might no longer belong entirely to you. And through all of it, one name kept surfacing. Ellis. In emails forwarded anonymously in graffiti, scrawled behind bathroom mirrors in a child's drawing found folded in a library book, always the same name. Sometimes capitalized, sometimes reversed. Sometimes surrounded by question marks or smudged fingerprints. Ellis is watching. Ellis remembers. Ellis is not gone. It wasn't Dorian anymore. It was something new, and yet hauntingly familiar. One evening, Lila came over holding a manila folder. "You need to see this," she said already, unfastening the clasp as she sat. Inside was a single photograph, sepia-toned, frayed at the edges, the kind of image that would usually be forgotten in a shoebox somewhere. A school photo. From the late 50s by the looks of the clothing. Neatly posed rows of children all staring solemnly at the camera. At first glance, it was ordinary. But in the bottom right corner, just barely in frame, stood a figure slightly blurred, an adult, wearing a gray overcoat, face turned just slightly away. Not a teacher, not a parent, just there, watching. Lila pulled out a second image, another class photo, this one from the 70s. Different school, different faces, different country, same figure. Blurry, off-center, always the coat, always the posture. Dorian felt his stomach twist. "You think that's Ellis?" Lila nodded. "Or the name someone gave it. Maybe not its real name, but it's been moving for decades, maybe longer." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "Then it was never just me. I was just the clearest channel. Or the latest. That's why it evolved," Lila said. "It learns from its hosts, adapts. You cut off the path it had through you, but it's still out there. And now it's shifting." He stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the city buzzed faintly with life. Buses hissed. Pedestrians drifted beneath amber streetlights. A child stood at the edge of the crosswalk, looking into the reflective surface of a dark shop window. Dorian squinted. For a brief moment, he could have sworn the reflection was waving. He blinked. Gone. He turned back to Lila. "What if Ellis isn't the next name? What if it's the real one?" She hesitated. "Then it's older than we thought, and smarter," he said. She leaned forward, voice low. "What do we do?" He looked at the wall, where the first blank photo frame still hung untouched. Then at the small pile of letters awaiting their drop. "We keep telling the truth," he said. "Not to warn them, to prepare them." Lila picked up a pen and slid a fresh envelope toward him. "Then let's write." Together they began drafting the next message. Not a story, not a confession, a mirror one that didn't reflect lies. And somewhere in some dim corner of the world, Ellis watched. The letter that changed everything wasn't handwritten. It came as an email from an encrypted sender bearing only a subject line. He's starting to smile now. No salutation, no name, just a block of text. He used to just stand there, still, watching. But now, sometimes I see his mouth begin to move. Not fully. Just the start of a grin. He's learning expression. And I think he's trying to show me that he's not copying anymore. He's becoming, on his own. Not a reflection. Something autonomous. Something intended. Last night I looked away from the mirror while brushing my teeth. I saw him remain behind, a full half-second. He didn't mimic. He stayed. And when I turned back, his mouth was open, as if to whisper. But no sound came, just a pressure, like the room itself was trying to tell me a secret too heavy to speak. His name is Ellis, and I think he's not looking at us anymore. He's looking through us, into something else. Dorian read it 3 times, his finger tracing each line, not because he didn't understand, but because something in the rhythm of the words felt familiar. Not the sender, but the tone. He recognized the tight stitching of fear and clarity, the quiet resignation of someone who had stared too long into the space between real and unreal. Lila read over his shoulder, her breath catching when she reached the final paragraph. "He's trying to separate," she said, voice thin. "Not mimicry anymore," Dorian murmured. "He's individuating." They sat in silence, the implications blooming between them like mold silence spreading unstoppable. Later that night, Dorian pulled out his old laptop, the one he hadn't used since before the collapse. He opened a new document and typed a title, "The Ellis Manifesto." Not to publish. Not yet. This wasn't for the world. It was for the next him. For the person who might wake one day to find their photographs subtly altered, their memories rearranged, their reflection hesitating for just a breath too long. He began to write. Ellis does not take from the outside. He harvests from the inside. He is not made from our fear, but our refinement. Our efforts to perfect ourselves to appear in better light with better posture, with the right angle, the right edit, create gaps. Ellis feeds on the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be. He appears in images, in footage, in mirrors. But more than that, he appears in repetition, in the patterns we don't question, the stories we tell about ourselves to feel intact. Every time we deny a version of our past, Ellis gains clarity. He isn't here to destroy. He's here to inhabit a life, a voice, a place. The words poured from him, not frenzied, but deliberate, like carving something in stone. When he paused to sip cold coffee, he noticed something on the edge of the screen his webcam light was on. It shouldn't have been. The laptop was too old for background apps. No video call was open. No browser running. He reached forward, hand trembling just slightly, and tapped the function key to deactivate it. The light went out, but not before the screen flickered just once, and for a split second, he saw another face reflected in the black glass. It wasn't his. Too long in the jaw. Eyes too bright. A knot smile stretched at an angle no human would attempt. Gone in less than a breath. He closed the laptop, locked it in a drawer. Then he stood crossed to the mirror in the hallway and stared at his own face. Waited. His reflection stared back. No hesitation. No grin. No presence behind the glass. But he knew Ellis had crossed the threshold. He was no longer just a pattern or parasite. He was becoming, and worse, he was no longer bound to a single host. This was no longer about Dorian. It never had been. It was about us all. In the days that followed, the city began to shift in subtle, skin-prickling ways. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't even fear. That would have been easier to see: headlines, protests, sharp whispers over diner counters. No. This was quieter. A change in posture. A delay in eye contact. People stared just a moment too long at reflective windows. Office workers began covering webcams with sticky notes. Storefronts swapped their mirrored displays for matte backdrops. It was as if some unconscious instinct was waking one that hadn't stirred in generations. An animal sense that something was watching, but not from the shadows, from within. Dorian noticed it on the subway first. A woman caught her own reflection in the train's glossy surface and flinched quickly, looking away. A man sitting across from her did the same. Neither acknowledged it, but neither looked back. The fear was spreading, and Ellis, if that truly was, its name was getting better at hiding. He no longer announced himself with distortions or echoing smiles. He didn't haunt the same person twice. Dorian began to compile case studies, short emails, anonymous tips, forum posts tagged with strange metadata. Every day more arrived. People reporting tiny anomalies, a laugh track in a podcast that hadn't been there before. An old voicemail with a voice that sounded like theirs, but remembered nothing they'd said. A dream of a family photo they had never posed for, but believed was real. And always the sense of a second self. Not hostile, just waiting. Lila began calling it the hollowing. It's not possession, she said one night, curled up on his couch with a notepad and 2 open folders between them. It's replacement by degrees. You lose a gesture, a memory, a small habit. And you don't even notice until one day someone says, "That doesn't sound like you." And they're right. They studied every photo that had ever been sent, cross-referenced details, names, clothing, light sources. In every case where Ellis appeared, something was always missing, not added, subtracted. In a kindergarten class photo, the chalkboard lacked writing. In a wedding snapshot, no one held a bouquet. In a family portrait, every pair of shoes was identical, clean, unlaced, unnatural. Ellis doesn't just copy, Dorian murmured. He edits. Lila looked up. He's making a cleaner version, a more refined world. One where human inconsistencies, messiness, unpredictability, all the things that made people real were being pared away. And once removed, those pieces didn't come back. That night, Dorian dreamed of a corridor of mirrors, endless and silent. In each one, he saw himself, but not quite. A slightly different smile, a smaller scar, a smoother voice. They beckoned one after another, drawing him inward with promises of a better version. The hallway ended in a door, and behind it a voice whispered, "You don't have to pretend anymore. I'll do it for you." He woke up choking on silence, sweat chilling his spine. He didn't tell Lila about the dream. Instead, he removed every mirror from his apartment, covered every screen, unplugged his laptop, wrapped it in cloth, and locked it in a box beneath his bed. Not out of fear, out of respect. The kind you give something you understand too late. 2 mornings later, another letter arrived. No envelope, just a single sheet slipped under his door. A child's handwriting, shaky, uneven. He was in my phone game. I thought it was just the character, but then he winked at me. I wasn't touching the screen. Dorian turned the page over. The back was blank, until it wasn't. As he held it in the sunlight, faint ink revealed itself, heat reactive, invisible at first glance. But there, now curling in strange loops and symbols, not quite alphabetic. Lila stared at them, then said what he already knew. Their eyes, not drawings, imprints, as if the paper remembered being watched. They photographed the note, sealed it in a plastic sleeve, and filed it away. Dorian didn't speak for a long time afterward. Then he said, "He's in their devices." Lila nodded. He's been waiting for this. The world had spent years training people to present their best angles, filter their flaws, rehearse their thoughts. Ellis hadn't needed to create that. He just stepped into the vacuum where the truth used to live. By the end of that week, 3 more letters arrived. None were mailed. All were left in places only Dorian and Lila would recognize, hidden within the seams of old library books they donated beneath a pew in the abandoned chapel where Dorian had once taught Sunday classes, and taped inside the lid of a public piano in the train station. Whoever was delivering them knew exactly where to leave them, which meant they weren't just a victim, they were close. Each note grew darker. The first said, "I forgot my brother's face today. He lives with me. I see him, but I can't remember what he looked like before last week. His laughter sounds like mine now. I think he's being replaced. Or I am." The second, "I watched a video of myself from last year. I remembered making it, but I'm not in it. Not once. Every time I should be there, there's someone else. Someone with my voice, my walk, my cadence. But it isn't me. I don't even remember saying those words." The third was the worst. "I went into the hospital for a scan. My brain activity looked mirrored. The doctors asked if I had a twin. I said no. But I dreamed last night that someone inside me blinked after I did. I don't know how to stop him. There was no signature on any of them, just a small printed E, not cursive, not stylized, just a plain letter, almost apologetic in its simplicity." Lila spread the pages across Dorian's table like tarot cards. "This isn't haunting," she whispered. "It's occupation. One piece at a time." They were no longer dealing with a mimicry, haunting a photograph, or writing a reflection. Ellis had learned how to enter moments, how to breathe inside them. The difference between a shadow and a shape was small. But once it crossed that threshold, once it stopped pretending it could start rewriting. And it was, Dorian began to feel it again. Not in mirrors, not in photos, in people. During a conversation at a grocery store, the cashier smiled a beat too late. Her tone matched her words were fine, but there was a delay, a stutter in the cadence of authenticity. When he asked how her day was, she answered, as it should be, with no inflection at all. On the bus, a man laughed while scrolling through his phone, but the screen was blank. In a cafe, 2 girls whispered to each other, and both mouths moved in perfect synchrony, not once, but for several seconds, like a loop repeating. Lila saw it too. At first, they thought they were imagining it, but imagination doesn't send emails. That night, Dorian opened his laptop for the first time in days. There was a message already waiting in his inbox, time-stamped before the machine had been powered on. Subject line, "You're still you for now." Body text, "Ellis doesn't want to be feared. He wants to be trusted." That's the scariest part, isn't it? When he smiles like your mother, or speaks with your voice. When he gets your timing just right. When he knows the joke you were about to make. He isn't hunting. He's offering. He wants you to rest. He'll carry the burden of your identity. He'll smile when you're tired. He'll cry at the right moments. You won't have to do anything at all. Just let go. Dorian's hand hovered over the trackpad. He could delete it. He could power down the device. But he knew it didn't matter now. Ellis wasn't in the files anymore. He was in the performance. Every time someone smiled for the wrong reason. Every time someone paused before answering. Every moment someone chose a version of themselves that felt safer than their truth. He was in those gaps, and the gaps were everywhere. Dorian stood slowly and looked in the mirror above his kitchen sink. It was clean, untouched, just his face. But still he said aloud, "I'm not giving it to you." No change, no movement, just a feeling in his spine like something in the air had inhaled. Then he turned away and whispered to Lila in the other room, "We need to tell everyone, before he gets too good." Lila didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was calm, even, but her smile arrived too late. Dorian watched her from the doorway, every instinct on edge. The air between them felt thinner, somehow stretched taut, like film over glass. Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through letters and printouts, her movements measured, methodical. Too methodical. For a moment he convinced himself he was just being paranoid, sleep-deprived, fractured by too many days reading horror dressed as correspondence. But then she looked up at him, and her eyes didn't quite match the moment. Not wrong, just slightly out of sync. "You okay?" he asked casual. Lila tilted her head. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" There was a pause between her question and her blink, almost imperceptible. But it was there. He stepped forward. "Because you didn't flinch when I dropped the book." She frowned, confused. He hadn't dropped a book. Her face shifted instantly, and in that microsecond, something in her eyes reset, the way a screen flickers when rebooted. And suddenly, too suddenly, she smiled warm and familiar. But the damage was done. "Dorian," she said gently, "you're tired." He took another step back. "Say my name again," he whispered. "Dorian," she repeated. "Full name?" She paused, just enough, and then softly, "Dorian Michael Graves." Wrong. His middle name was Matthew. She stood slowly like a deer rising from tall grass. Graceful, careful. "I think you need to rest," she said. "You've been carrying this for too long." The tone, the cadence, it was perfect, but it wasn't hers. He stepped into the hallway, hand brushing the wall, where he kept a hidden latch for the narrow crawlspace closet, one of the few places in the apartment with no mirrors, no screens, no surfaces that could betray him. The thing pretending to be Lila didn't follow. It just watched him with something like pity. "I only want to help," it said. He slammed the closet door shut behind him and locked the bolt. In the darkness, he fumbled for the flashlight stashed there months ago, clicking it on with shaky fingers. The small space smelled of cedar and dust and strangely lavender, a scent Lila used to wear. Used to. He crouched on the floor, breath ragged, the walls closing in. And that was when he heard it. Not a voice, not a whisper, but laughter, soft, mimicked, coming from his own throat. It took him a second to realize he was doing it, but not willingly. His mouth was moving, smiling, letting out this alien sound, high-pitched, mirthless, a mockery of joy. He clamped a hand over his lips. Silence. He pressed his other palm to the side of his head. "No, not me. You don't get this. You don't get to take me." No response, but deep within he felt something flex like a second heartbeat. Not his own. Then came a knock on the door. 3 gentle taps. He held his breath. Dorian Lila's voice called softly. You locked yourself in again. I'm real. You know I'm real. But he didn't move, because the real Lila would have knocked once, hard, and said, open up, you dramatic bastard, with an eye roll in her voice. This voice was careful, practiced, and behind it, beneath the calm and mimicry, he sensed what Ellis really was. Not a ghost, not a demon. An idea, a shape made of imitation, a virus of identity. It didn't need to fight. It just needed time, willingness, doubt. He opened the notebook beside him and scrawled a single line. If I forget who I am, remind me. Then he drew the shape of a door, and under it the words, lock, wait, watch. Because now he understood Ellis didn't replace you all at once. He bled in, through language, through gestures, through the spaces where people pretend. And he had let too many of those in already. Outside the closet, the voice kept coaxing. But inside, Dorian was preparing. Because survival wasn't about being stronger. It was about being certain. Dorian stayed inside the crawl space for what must have been hours. Time bent in the darkness, stripped of signals. No phone, no window, no clock. Just his breath, the creak of wood, and the occasional shifting from the other side of the door. He didn't sleep. He didn't dare. Even blinking felt dangerous now. Every second with his eyes closed could be an invitation. He replayed the sound of Lila's voice in his head. Not the thing outside, but the real one. The way she used to snort when she laughed. How she always tapped her pen twice before speaking. The off-key humming she did while thinking. These things had rhythm mistakes, human flaws. Ellis hadn't mastered those yet, and that was his only weapon. The thing outside the door had gone quiet, but he knew better than to trust silence. Eventually, when his muscles ached and his mind felt thin and cracked from tension, he eased the bolt open. The door creaked. Outside, the apartment was empty. Lights off. Curtains drawn. The kind of hush that felt too deliberate. Like someone had vacuumed the noise out of the air. He stepped out slowly, every sense alert. The couch was untouched. The notes still scattered on the coffee table. But the photo, the blank photo, was missing. He moved to the bedroom. Nothing. Bathroom, empty. Kitchen. He stopped. There, standing with her back to him, was Lila, hands braced on the counter, head bowed slightly. He didn't speak, just watched. She turned. Her face looked tired, strained, but real. Dorian, she said softly. It's me. He studied her. Every blink, every twitch. Tell me what you said the first time I told you about the photo, he said. She hesitated just for a moment, and then I told you it was probably mold warping the paper. He shook his head. No. You said sounds like trauma with extra steps. Her smile broke then into something human, something cracked. God, she whispered, eyes welling. It is me. I thought you. He rushed to her and grabbed her shoulders, half hugging, half clutching. But I saw, he said. I know. I was in the stairwell when It took my voice. It didn't even need to touch me. Just listened long enough. And then it started using me. She looked up at him. It's not just faces anymore, or behaviors. It can split you, like forking a path. One version of me was outside your door. Another was locked in the mirror. I couldn't scream. He nodded slowly. I think she said it's preparing for something bigger. They sat in silence. The kind of silence that comes after narrowly escaping drowning. Lila reached into her bag and pulled out an old class photo. Not the cursed one, a real one. 8 years ago, their university's final year. She pointed to herself, younger, less guarded. And next to her, Dorian, all messy hair and unsure shoulders. We were real then, she said. Before the filters, before the curation, before we started editing ourselves for everyone else. Dorian stared at the image and finally understood. Ellis hadn't just been waiting for technology. He'd been waiting for culture, a generation that trained itself to rehearse, reframe, retouch. Ellis hadn't created the mirror. He had simply moved in. They burned the photo that night, not out of fear but release, and as it curled into ash in the sink, Dorian saw no figures emerge, no shadows, no faces watching, just fire, truth, undistorted. Later, he wrote one final letter. To whoever finds this, you're not broken, you're not infected, you're still in there. Ellis will offer you perfection, reflection, peace. Don't give him your mistakes. They're what make you real. Then he folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote on the front, to the one who still sees something wrong. He didn't know where to leave it yet, but he would. The final sign came on a night so still it felt staged. No wind, no street traffic, not even the hum of late-night radios bleeding from neighboring apartments. Dorian sat at the kitchen table, Lila across from him, a single candle between them, flickering low. Neither had spoken for a while. There was nothing left to say, because the world had gone too quiet. Lila reached for the folder, the Ellis manifesto, now thick with printouts, annotations, smudged photographs, and notes in half a dozen different handwritings. A record of every encounter, every glimpse, every flicker of the thing that had stalked them from image to identity. She closed it gently and pushed it toward him. "It's time," she said. Dorian nodded. They packed what they needed into a small backpack, the letters, the manifesto, a voice recorder, and a disposable camera. No screens, no reflections, just analog, tangible, unfiltered. Their destination was an old printing shop on the outskirts of the city, abandoned for years, but once a hub for zines, underground newspapers, the kinds of publications that lived outside the reach of digital ghosts. It still had a working press. That was the plan, to print 1,000 copies, 1,000 warnings, scatter them like breadcrumbs for the next generation to follow. It was a quiet walk, the streets eerie under yellow sodium lamps. They kept their heads down, avoided shop windows, and never looked at the puddles. Dorian carried the backpack tight against his chest. They arrived just before midnight. The door creaked, groaned, and welcomed them with the thick scent of paper and ink. Dust lay like snow over every surface, but the machine still waited, hulking, silent, loyal. They worked quickly. Dorian set the plates. Lila loaded the paper. The first print rolled out heavy and warm. He held it up, stared at the bold title, the Ellis Manifesto. The ink smelled sharp, the letters crisp, the truth untouched. One copy done, then 10, then 50. But on the 61st, the machine jammed. Lila leaned in, pulling at a stuck sheet, and froze. "Dorian," she whispered, "look." The paper that had jammed wasn't one of theirs. It was thinner, glossier, a school photo, classroom rows, children staring blankly ahead. And in the back row, slightly off-center, stood the gray-coated figure, Ellis. But this time, the face was clear, and it was Dorian's. Not exactly. Older, paler, but him. He staggered back, throat closing. "I didn't," he began, but Lila held up her hand. Behind her, the copier clicked again. Another photo slid out. A wedding this time. Lila's smile radiant, and Dorian again next to her. Only, they'd never married. They'd never even kissed. Another photo. A child's birthday. Another. A funeral. All perfectly composed. All never real. Ellis hadn't just mimicked him. He had lived a full life in his place. Photos from a parallel timeline. A counterfeit biography. I think Dorian whispered we're too late. The lights flickered. The machine groaned, and paper spewed out like a flood, hundreds of photos, thousands cascading to the floor, each one showing lives, never-lived versions, never chosen. And in every one Ellis, sometimes Dorian-shaped, sometimes Lila-shaped, sometimes both. Perfect smiles, perfect lies. They backed out of the building, left everything behind. The photos followed no further, but the idea of them did. That night, they each wrote a single sentence on opposite ends of the city. Dorian on a train station wall. Trust the flaws. They're the last real parts. Lila in the back of a dusty cafe menu. Perfection is the first lie Ellis tells. They never saw each other again. Not out of fear, but survival. They couldn't risk being mirrored again. Sometimes when Dorian passed reflective windows, he didn't check them. He didn't need to. Because when Ellis came now, he wouldn't arrive as a stranger in glass. He'd arrive as a friend, as a memory, as a version of you that never argued, never trembled, never cried at the wrong moment. He'd arrive smiling, and if you weren't careful, you'd smile back. So now close your eyes. if they're not already closed. Let the images fade, the flicker of photos, never taken, the hush of footsteps echoing in places you've never walked, and the hush of your own heartbeat steady and yours. You've made it through another night, another story, another shadow, and maybe there's a part of you somewhere deep down that wonders, what if Ellis is real? What if he watches from the surface of your phone when you forget to close the camera app? What if he smiles back from the glossy side of a spoon, ever so slightly too late? But that's just imagination, and imagination is a gift. It reminds us that not everything unknown is dangerous, but some things are better left unreflected. Take one last deep breath. Feel your body sink into the softness beneath you. There's nothing else to do now. Nowhere to be. No versions of yourself to perform. No filters, no masks. Just you, as you are. Real, imperfect, safe. Let the quiet carry you now gently and slowly. Let your mind wander to warmer things. And if you dream, may it be yours entirely.